to the Kent Lapp Podcast.
All right, David Filson.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you.
This is quite a privilege and honor. I'm so happy you're here.
Well, I appreciate your flexibility and patience.
You're a tough man to nail down.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. You're here now.
Yeah,
welcome.
I'm glad to
it's
be
a beautiful
here.
fall day out there too. It's just gorgeous. That
gorgeous.
bright blue sky and the sun. It's warmer than normal. It is perfect.
Yeah, it's like San Diego out there right now.
Yeah, it really does feel like San Diego. It absolutely does. All right, so what's going on with the biceps here? You've been lifting some. I've been seeing on Instagram.
Forklifts. Mashed potatoes and gravy over here.
Golly.
And meatloaf over here. That's all it is.
What are you doing? I mean, you've actually bulked up since the last time I've seen you. I know in church, I know the last time I saw you had a coat on, of course.
Yeah.
But still, I feel like you've bulked up since I've seen you last.
Yeah, I probably have. I started working out in earnest back in 2014. The reason for it was because in 2013, December, my family went to Disney World for Christmas. We were there on Christmas Day, and it was great. It was awesome. And so my little girl at the time, now she's 17, but at the time she wanted to go see Beauty and the Beast, the stage play there at Hollywood Studios. And so we go, and the characters all come out in costumes, and it was incredible. But the guy playing Gaston, you remember Gaston? He's like the conceited, good-looking, like really, built guy. No one sings like Gaston, has biceps like Gaston, So he comes out, and this dude was not wearing a muscle suit. He was just yoked. He was jacked. And he comes out and starts flexing. I'm sitting there. My wife's sitting next to me looking at him.
Like no shirt?
He had his shirt on, but it was barely holding on because when he would flex, it would just, right? And so he comes out. I'm sitting there. My wife's looking at this guy up on stage, and then she's looking at this toe sack of potatoes sitting next to her that she's married to. I thought, I got to do something about this. So I come back after Christmas, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to do like everybody does at the turn of the year, gym and Jesus, right? You gotta go to the gym. You gotta get serious about Jesus again. So I go to the local gym there in Bellevue, and I become a member. And what I didn't intend to, but apparently what I signed up for is like the once a month plan, because I went like once in January and twice in February. And then in March on spring break, the guy that managed the gym, I was on spring break up in St. Louis where my wife's parents live. And he calls me up. This is March of 2014. He said, "Hey, David," he said, this is Jeff at the gym. "I've been noticing your attendance record." He said, "Man, you've been 3 times since you signed up. You're pathetic." And he said, "You need a trainer." I said, "Well, I can't afford a trainer." He said, "Well, if you don't get a trainer, this is pointless. You don't need to be here."
Yep.
So I go ahead and sign up for a package of 8 sessions.
With a trainer?
With a trainer. Walk in the day I'm supposed to meet the trainer. This big, like 6'4", just shredded, tatted black dude walks up to me. He has a shirt on that says "Kicking Your Ass One Step at a Time." I'm running on the treadmill trying to get warmed up. This dude walks up to me and he says, "You ready?" I said, at that moment I'm thinking to myself, no. He says, "You ready?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I just made 2 people throw up today. Why are you here?" And I started to question why I was there. But anyway, he started working me out. 15 minutes into a 30-minute session, I was crying physically, literally just crying like a little girl. I was crying, begging him to stop, and he wouldn't. And when he saw that I was about to pass out, he had mercy on me, told me to go splash some water on my face. That began a 2-month kind of trying to get my endurance up. And every day I'd leave the gym thinking I was going to pass out in the parking lot. What I didn't know at the time, that was over March, the spring and summer, I kept at it, and of 2014. And I thought I was just doing it to maybe kind of get in shape and impress my wife. What I didn't realize was that October, my mama, and you don't know a bigger mama's boy than the guy you're talking to right now, my mama was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in October of 2014. And I honestly think it was probably lifting that along with the word and prayer that probably kept me sane.
Really?
Yeah. Just in the midst of that horrific, and she lived for 8 months. But I look back at that, and then when I wrote my dissertation, which writing a dissertation, it does strange things to you mentally, like just emotionally, mentally, when you have to disappear for like a year and become almost not human in an effort to do it. Like you sort of abstract from the rest of society in order to be able to write a dissertation. Yet I stayed with the gym. I think the gym has just been a thing that's kept me sane. So There you go.
Wow. Were these personal training sessions 30 minutes?
They were 30 minutes.
Okay, so just 30 minutes, but it was a very hard 30 minutes.
Very
and
hard.
Were you expected to warm up before you started the 30 minutes?
Come in, do a little treadmill, just get your blood going.
Okay.
And then, and that guy, he was really just focused on more cardio endurance kind of thing. And the interesting thing about this guy was, as he found out that, I was a preacher, a minister, some sort of man of the cloth, whatever he was trying to figure that out. It provided an opportunity for me to really talk with him about the things of the Lord. And I'll never forget Easter Sunday morning. I don't know where I get a text from him. He just said, "Thinking about you, would you please pray for me?" I thought, oh my goodness. And that began a beautiful kind of relationship with him. He ended up moving back to Miami. And then I got another trainer just for a short time who was an ex-Marine and a professional boxer. He's the one who really taught me about lifting, about the mechanics of lifting and how not to mess yourself up in that regard. Then I ended up doing his wedding. He's
that's
awesome.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
That's what it means to be in the world, right?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you, so you're still lifting?
Yeah.
Well, I saw you on Instagram. You are. How many days a week are you going into the gym?
I try to get in, 5 days a week at least, and 6 if I can. Like a 6th day will typically be just some kind of stretching, mobility kind of things, and the other 5 will be heavier lifting. And I do push pull. I just do it as I do a push day, which is moving weight away from me. Pull day, pulling weight toward me, and that way you give huge muscle groups an opportunity to kind of recover, especially at my age, because I just turned 54 last week. Okay. So I'm
Happy birthday.
Thank you. I'm like Father Time. I'm Captain Geritol sitting over here across from you.
Yep.
So I need those rest days in between. They're kind of, rest days are as important as lifting
Absolutely.
days. So,
and are you doing cardio as well, or are you really focusing on lifting? You're obviously doing a fair amount of lifting. I mean, it wouldn't be that bulk if you hadn't, but are you mixing in some cardio as well?
I get on the treadmill and I warm up. I'll get on the treadmill sometimes after I've lifted if I have time and run at the end, but I don't do a ton. I think lifting is cardio. Heavy lifting is cardio.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's more fun cardio for sure.
For sure.
What's your height? What's your height and weight?
I am 5'11" and I weigh 237.
237, and you don't have a lot of fat on you either. That's a lot of muscle. I mean, it really looks like
that's because the tables.
It's working.
The table's covering the rest of me up.
What is it about the gym or exercise or lifting that kept you sane through that difficult time? Because that's something that pops up a lot on here. Yeah,
I think so. So during my mama's cancer journey, the gym was the one place that I could go. There were two things. There were two places. One, I'm one of the pastors over at Christ Presbyterian over on Old Hickory Boulevard, and we have a balcony, and there was this little nook cut out back in the day where they would put a camera for recording the service. It's not used anymore. Just this empty little nook, and I would go up there and pray. I would literally go up there and just get on my face before the Lord and pray. That was a constant for me, and the gym was a constant. And so I think being able to go in, hit it hard, and it was just a way of processing all the emotion and everything while at the same time just hitting it hard. Mm-hmm. And I think it was just the constancy of it.
Okay.
And the sameness. I needed some sameness or some constancy because, for anyone who's gone through that kind of thing with a loved one or themselves, they've gone through some kind of, sickness or whatever. Things are just always changing, and you're constantly worried about the next phone call, the next scan, the next whatever. And I think it was just the sameness of the gym that was sort of, stabilizing for me.
Yeah. Tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and what you're doing. And I'm curious this morning, it sounded like you were somewhere teaching. But yeah, just give us a little bit of a rundown.
Yeah. So I am pastor for theology and discipleship at Christ Presbyterian Academy and Church. And I oversee all of the Christian worldview, Bible, theology, et cetera, at the academy. It's a pre-K through 12. We have over 1,400 students there over in Old Hickory Boulevard.
1,400.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I teach an apologetics class in the upper school. And then I'm one of the pastors on staff at the church as well. Yep. And then I'm also an adjunct professor of historical and theological studies at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, where I did my dissertation, and I'm a visiting lecturer at RTS Atlanta and Charlotte in historical theology and apologetics.
Mm-hmm. And you have kids. How many and what age is roughly?
Yeah. So my son Luke is a sophomore at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, and he's very involved with Reformed University Fellowship there, which is the PCA's campus ministry, Presbyterian Church in America's campus ministry. He's very involved with that, and he loves the Lord. He's just a sweetheart, and kind of this kid who, I don't know, he's just a very compassionate, sensitive guy, long flowing hair, devilishly good looking. It's all the things you just can't stand.
All the things you get from your pops?
No, he got none of that from me. You see my wife, he gets it all from her. And then my daughter Lydia is a junior at Christ Pres Academy.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah, and she's in the arts and sings and acts, and she's the most alive human being I've ever known in my life, to be honest with you.
Oh, that's wonderful. So you have a boy and a girl.
I do.
Very cool.
Yeah.
You have on your Instagram bio, of the various things you have listed there, you have Republican listed.
Yeah.
Do you find that as a pastor, that is a challenge for people to overcome, or do you find that people are objective, and even if they may not have that political viewpoint, they realize that, hey, there's a lot of people in America, and different people have different opinions, and some are more Democratic, and some are more Republican, some are anywhere in between. And he happens to be one that is Republican, and he's my pastor, and I disagree with him, and that's just the way it is. Do you find it's more objective, or do you find it's more contentious?
I hope that it's more objective and conducive for what my real commitment is the free exchange of ideas and civil discourse. And by that I mean, I think there's a whole lot of what I'm going to call postmodern smoothie boy dancing and bait switching switching baiting going on. I mean, what I mean by that is we don't really let people know what our convictions, what our positions are, honestly, and like in an act of vulnerability. This is where I am on this. This is my position. This is my stance. Can we engage in legitimate conversation? Right? Over the last kind of 20 years, everything's about the dialogue, the story, the conversation, entering into the conversation, that kind of thing. And conversation's really, really difficult when we don't even have the freedom to sit down and say, this is where I am on this. This is my position. What's your position? Can we just be honest with each other? Colossians chapter 3, one of the things that Paul says after he says, if then you've been raised with Christ, set your minds on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God, for, your life is hid with Christ in God, etc. When Christ, too, as your life appears, you'll appear with him in glory. Then he says in the very next verse, nekrosateun in the Greek, put to death, therefore. And he lists this long list of things. And one of the things he says is, stop lying to each other. And so the reason that I say that I'm a Republican on my Instagram, and I know when I say that, that's going to probably alienate me from some people, but it's to say, yeah, my convictions politically tend to line up Republican. I'm just being honest with you. Now, can we have the conversation? I'm not saying that in the sense that I'm saying if your political convictions line up otherwise, that we can't have fellowship, we can't have friendship.
Yep.
I think a lot of people would probably be very surprised at how many of my friends, and frankly, a lot of my, maybe not so many of my closer friends, but a lot of my just acquaintances that we just hang out and have fun and so forth, would not agree with me politically on a pretty broad spectrum of things, but at least they know that I'm not trying to pull the wool over their eyes and make them think I'm something I'm not.
Yeah, I can really appreciate that. Was it like this? You're 54, so was it like this 30 years ago? It feels like now the only way you hang out with people is if you all have the same beliefs and you kind of all agree, which of course is preposterous because we all have different opinions and beliefs and ideas, and that's the way it should be. That's what's beautiful about society. And there should be a free exchange of ideas. Do you feel now that 30 years ago, say, that was more the case, where people with different opinions and different thoughts could get together and still be friends and hash those out in a reasonable manner, and we're losing that? Or is this is just how it's always been?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I love that question. A couple of things. Politics is always a dirty business because, as C.S. Lewis said, if you're not going to be ruled by God, you're going to be ruled by men, and men are always, right, we're always hungry and thirsty for power, and so politics can become a very, very unsavory space, right? But yeah, 30 years ago, I love that. um, consider the debate. Just go in and check out the debate on YouTube between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. There you have a Democrat and a Republican. They were divided across a number of issues, but there was a sense of respect, and even as they would take kind of funny jabs at each other, it was almost like at times they were trying to make each other laugh. I mean, you think back to when Sam Donaldson asked Ronald Reagan, "Are you concerned about your age? Because you're going to be the oldest president." And he said, "I refuse to make age an issue in this presidential campaign. I will not exploit the youth and lack of experience of my opponent." And Walter Mondale cracks up laughing.
It's so great.
It's so great.
So great.
And so, 30 years ago, I think while politics has always been a very, very contentious thing, we've moved into kind of in this late postmodern era, I think a cultural milieu in which division is seemingly so unavoidable. So like you say, we only hang out and we only run around in echo chambers. We only exist in echo chambers. And so frankly, part of me putting that I'm a Republican, I put a number of things on my Instagram bio that could probably cause people to cancel me, right? I'm a Calvinist, I'm a Presbyterian, I'm a Van Tillian in my epistemology and apologetic approach. But I put that on there not because I'm a politico, though I do read a ton of political history and political philosophy and that sort of thing. But I put that out there hopefully as an invitation to say, this is honestly who I am. Mm-hmm. And if I'm wrong, here's the thing. If I'm wrong on a particular political stance, you can't correct me if you don't know where I am on it.
That's right. Yep.
And so in some ways, the only way to have honest civil discourse is to have the respect necessary between parties or between individuals, between groups, where you can be honest about your positions. You can't correct me, and I'm sure I need correction. A person can't correct me if I'm somehow speaking in such a nebulous way, which is I think the hallmark of postmodernism. And this comes from Wittgenstein and Derrida, where words basically have no meaning and there's no objectivity in predication. We just kind of play around with words as though they are this nebulous thing, and it makes conversation really, really difficult. Mm-hmm. And so when conversation is difficult, man, we just spike the emotion, divide, and draw swords.
What does being a Republican or having Republican viewpoints mean? Did you already touch on it when you said the free exchange of ideas? Is there some things you would build around that? I'm not looking necessarily for a technical definition. I'm just curious how you think about why would you identify there? What are some of the values or beliefs there that you don't see elsewhere, and that's why you would identify as Republican?
Right. I think a couple of three of the main things for me are a commitment to a limited government. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not libertarian.
Okay.
And the reason that I'm not libertarian, though I respect a number of libertarian authors, you think of guys like Thomas Sowell and a handful of others who is just brilliant, author and economist and so forth. But one of the things about, say, libertarianism is that I do believe the government has a role in the care of the downtrodden, the poor, that the government does need to speak into that. And some strains of libertarianism can become so focused on the individual that individualism becomes justified in some strains of libertarianism. So for me, being a Republican is a commitment to a limited government, but probably more than anything, compassion. Compassion. And I see in republicanism at its best compassion expressed across a number of fronts, not the least of which is the dignifying of the individual and the enabling of the individual to better his or her circumstances. And I'll be honest with you, I think, and here's where I may get a little bit controversial, as I think about the current climate today and the legitimate cries and needs in minorities and the concerns that are there. That have been in the media in a very heightened way in the last several months. I think you can look back at the 60s with the Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson and some of the policies that were put in place actually in the name of caring about civil rights and concerns of minorities have actually not turned out to facilitate that. And so I think here we are now looking at some of the things that are going on in culture around us arising out of legitimate cries, needs, despair, etc. But then I think you have certain groups that come in and try to hijack the moral authority of the civil rights movement and ride on the coattails of that. And I don't think they're the same thing.
Yeah. And just to clarify, when you say Republican, are you saying you're a proponent of a Republican form of government, or you're saying you identify with the Republican Party, or is that one and the same?
For me, it's one and the same.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. So when I'm saying that, I'm saying I am a Republican in the sense that the party that started in 1860 as the anti-slavery party, I would identify with that.
Did you ever hear Sam Harris?
Mm-hmm.
I think he might be an atheist, but he's pretty brilliant guy. It seems like
he's both.
Yeah, he is, and he has Making Sense with Sam Harris. It's a podcast. It's episode 207, and it's an hour and 52 minutes long. I think I listened to it the other day, and it's the best thing I've heard all summer and what's going on right now. It's really, really good.
Wow.
And he's just very rational. He's reasonable. It's intellectual. And it speaks to some of the things you're talking about, which is, I think you have maybe the far left trying to like take this moral high ground, and some of the things are just unreasonable. And he kind of fleshes that out in that episode. Where do you get your smarts? How long have you been a pastor?
So my mama told me that when I was 3 years old, she heard a noise down the hallway, and I had stacked up some cardboard boxes in my bedroom and was standing behind my little pulpit, and I was preaching, and she said I was just...
No way.
Yeah. I don't, of course, remember this, but she said, yeah, you were in there, you stacked up these boxes, and you were standing behind this little cardboard pulpit you had made, and you were just going, and God, and God, and God. Of course, now I'm a Calvinist, and so that sermon would be, but God, but God, but God.
That's true. That's the difference, isn't it?
That's the difference.
My man.
There you go. In a nutshell.
That's a pretty key difference, isn't it? It's one word, but it makes a big difference.
I don't mean to flame my Arminian friends and brothers and sisters, but I'm just putting it out there.
And God, but God, yeah. So 3 years old.
Yeah, and so I think my whole life, I love Jesus, and he's everything.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is everything to me. And even as a little boy, right? I mean, and I was into everything little boys are into, toys and riding my bike and I collected Star Wars toys. I mean, everything. I mean, but there was nothing, even as a little boy, that mattered to me more than Jesus. And so I think I always knew at some level that I was to live for him. And then when I became a teenager, it was when I was 16 years old that our little Baptist church I grew up in Gallatin, Tennessee, that I just shared with the congregation that I believed I was called to the ministry, and I was what we called back then surrendering to the call to ministry, and I did. And then I went to our denomination's college up in southern Indiana, and I did a degree in Christian education, and it was there that I encountered for the first time kind of the remnants of neo-orthodoxy and classical liberalism. I encountered names like Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Barth, et cetera. And I remember going in, and one of my professors telling me early on, probably the first week of class, David, you need to have a genuine faith that can be genuine enough without having to accept biological impossibilities like a virgin birth or Adam and Eve being the first created human beings, the bodily resurrection of Christ from the dead. The idea that Jesus physically rose from the grave is a biological impossibility. And so what the resurrection actually is is when the principles of love and neighbor love and service to others, when those principles came to life in the followers of Jesus, in that sense, Jesus rose up all over again. So the resurrection is more of a sort of an ethical metaphor. Of course, Paul deals with that in 1 Corinthians 15 and says if Jesus is not physically raised from the dead, we're screwed. That's in the Greek, right? If Jesus is not raised from the dead, we are of all men most to be pitied. So that was my first encounter really with formal theology. And then I played in bands and stuff, and I was in a band, and there was a friend of mine who was in our band, she and her husband, and he was a drummer, and she sang, and her brother was Reformed in his theology. She had an older brother. And so I graduated college in 1988, and she, for my birthday that year, got me a copy of R.C. Sproul's Holiness of God. Well, I didn't want to read it because the last thing in the world I wanted was another theology book, because theology books to me were those things that kind of denigrated and attempted to undermine scriptural authority, that kind of thing. So why would I want to read another theology book? You know, I'd had my fill of Barth and Bultmann and other Schleiermachers and other figures like that. But I read the book and couldn't put it down, Holiness of God, and started reading everything I could get my hands on by him and a handful of others who were writing at the time at kind of pop-level theology. And I remember back in the day, you know, there was no podcast. You couldn't go online and order anything. And so I would get these catalogs from Ligonier Ministries in Orlando, Florida, and I would circle the cassette tape albums that I wanted. I would send I mail a form off with a check and wait, and like 4 to 6 weeks later, they would arrive. And so I just started absorbing everything I could in terms of biblical, theological materials. But I'll say this, probably one of the main things for me was when I was a kid, and especially in my early teenage years, I just memorized scripture all the time. Just memorized long passages of the Bible that are with me to this day. Now, you know, I memorized it then in the old King James Version. Now, you know, it comes out MSV, the Mid-South version, when I quote, but kind of a conglomeration of my own knowledge of Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and, you know, ESV and NIV and whatever, but I call it MSV. But I think after I started really trying to read everything, get my hands on, I just started ordering books left, right, and center. So that by the time I left for seminary, did my first seminary course at RTS Orlando. I did one course, went down there, took a course with Dr. Sinclair Ferguson. It was on Calvin's Doctrine of the Holy Spirit.
Oh, man, his book, The Whole Christ, right there. It's
The Whole Christ. Man. If I were a rich man, I would just keep a case of them in my trunk and just hand them out. It's
absolutely
pure gold. Yep. Of course, The Whole Christ is his kind of updated take on his lectures that were done back in, I believe, 1985 on the Morrow controversy, the Octorotter Creed and Thomas Boston and that Scottish controversy around the grace of God and salvation, and do you have to forsake your sins in order to come to Christ? Like, well, if I could forsake my sins, I wouldn't need Christ, right? That's kind of the rub there.
Yep.
I need Christ because I can't forsake my sins. Help. But so I had my first course with Dr. Ferguson, and I'll never forget. I was down in Orlando, and I ended up then doing my MDiv at Covenant. I'll say a bit about that here in a second, but I will never forget. First day of class, first seminary course, Dr. Ferguson comes in, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Let us pray." And he launched into what was probably about a 15-minute prayer. And I thought to myself, I have never heard anyone pray like that. The next morning, I made sure that I recorded his prayers. I have a recording of all those prayers from that week of coursework down there. And then I ended up, going to Covenant Theological Seminary, doing my MDiv there, met my wife in St. Louis. I loved my time at Covenant. The professors there were amazing. Some of my dearest friends to this day are some of the professors I had there. Dr. Hans Bayer, who was a German New Testament professor, was my Greek professor. So you got a German guy teaching Greek to a redneck, but it worked. Dr. Robert Peterson, I was the TA for him. He was a systematic theology professor. I was his TA, just a wonderful, sweet men there. And then met my wife. We married in St. Louis. The last semester that I had there in seminary. But one of the things that happened while I was in seminary, that I was there from 94 to 97, and my first year to seminary, my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So I knew that I needed to get back to Nashville eventually. And my plan was to leave St. Louis, finish, and then go to Westminster and do a PhD there residentially. But with Daddy getting sick, I knew I was going to have to move back to help my mama take care of him. And he passed away on March 18th of 2001. But after finished seminary there, I was accepted into a modular PhD program at Westminster, which allowed me to work on it not being full-time residential in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And so I just fly back and forth for coursework and did that over a number of years and finished my doctorate there in historical and theological studies. And it ends up that Dr. Ferguson was one of my main professors at Westminster for coursework.
Oh, wow.
So got to know him over the years, and he is, I think he's one of God's greatest living gifts to the church. If you listen to that man preach, it's just, I don't know, it's seraphic. It really, I mean, his preaching is so, it is such a beautiful tapestry of historical theology, deep biblical, theological, Christocentric hermeneutics with this very, very Puritan-esque, physician of the soul, pastoral touch. Yeah. So
the PhD, the modular PhD with Westminster, you said?
Yes.
Is that what caused the dissertation in 2013, 2014, or is that something different?
So the dissertation was actually finished. I actually finished and graduated in 2018.
Okay.
I wrote it in 2017 in earnest, but I'd been researching it for a number of years. So for the longest time, my focus was Jonathan Edwards, and my academic focus. I teach courses on Edwards for RTS and for Westminster. I've published in scholarly journals and say the Encyclopedia of Jonathan Edwards article on the beatific vision in Edwards and other articles and so forth. So Edwards was a really big part of my academic life, and I think was my trajectory, was that was going to be the real focus of my academic efforts. But then along the way, I was just rooting around down in the archives in St. Louis. We'd gone up to visit my wife's parents, and the PCA Historical Center is in St. Louis at Covenant Theological Seminary. Wayne Sparkman's the director of it. Well, I was down there, and I was just curious. I said, "Hey, do you have any of Francis Schaeffer's papers down here?" He said, "Well, no, we only have a couple of things of Schaeffer's, but we have some other things that may be of interest to you. You've got this little picture of B.B. Warfield from when he was a kid, and we have a couple of letters between J. Oliver Buswell and Cornelius Van Till." I said, "Oh, show me." And so they showed me, and then I thought to myself, wow, they've got this here. There must be a ton of stuff in the archives at Westminster. So I made a trip to Westminster and went rooting around in the archives at Westminster and was blown away at the voluminous correspondence between J. Oliver Buswell, who was a Presbyterian minister and theologian. He was at Covenant Seminary back in the 50s and 60s. He was a minister in the Bible Presbyterian Church. And Cornelius Van Till, who was the first professor of apologetics at Westminster. And some would see him as really the founding father of what's known as presuppositional apologetics, which oftentimes can be misconstrued. What is presuppositional apologetics? But anyway, all of those guys, Schaeffer, Buswell, Van Til, were all contemporaries. So I found all of this correspondence between them. And in the correspondence were a number of copies of syllabi back and forth with marginalia. So this is before email, this is before texting, any of that kind of thing. And so for professors to interact with each other, one would send his syllabus to the other professor. That professor would make marginalia, which are just notes in the margins. So if our listeners want to sound very sophisticated today, rather than say I make notes in the margins, just say I make marginalia, and you'll sound very...
I like it. I'm going to keep that one for sure.
Very French almost, So all the marginalia, and I started looking at all this stuff, and here's the thing, none of this had been touched. In all of the secondary literature on Van Til at the time, there was maybe a page worth in everything I could find in all the secondary literature on Van Til and Buswell. Everybody knows, for instance, about the Van Til, Gordon Clark controversy that happened in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, but there was very little on Buswell and Van Til. So I knew at that moment I had struck a vein that had been untouched.
Mm-hmm.
Edwards is a fairly well-plowed field in many ways, though I had a couple of angles that I was going to approach that I think would have been fruitful, but this was just completely untapped in every way.
So did you complete your PhD then in 2018?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so relatively recently.
Relatively recently, worked on it a number of years while I planted a church and pastored.
I see. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were on vacation in Florida a couple of years ago and went to the bookstore and got a few books. The Whole Christ was one of them. And man, I could not put it down. It's so marked up. It was amazing. But yeah, you mentioned R.C. Sproul. And it's hard for me to like hear about R.C. Sproul without getting a little bit emotional because he really is deeply meaningful to both my wife and I. Yeah. And he was instrumental in our journey into Reformed theology. And it was like when that happened, when that clicked, July 26th of 2015, I mean, it was just like seeing around a corner we'd never seen around before. And it was beautiful. Yeah. And R.C. Sproul was extremely instrumental in that. You got emotional when you're telling us that Jesus is deeply meaningful to you. Is there a particular aspect of what Jesus has done for you, of your relationship, of his kingship, that is particularly meaningful to you?
Yeah, I think it's the tenderness of his compassion and just the beauty of who he is. Jonathan Edwards is very, formative for me in terms of kind of the giants upon whose shoulders we stand, the giants and giantesses upon whose shoulders we stand. Edwards lived from 1703 to 58, and he would speak of Jesus in such a way that really put lyrics to the music I'd been hearing all my life. And what I mean by that is he borrowed Lockean sense perception language, which was the philosophical language of his day. So, of course, if you know anything about, John Locke, the idea of empiricism, we don't have innate ideas, we know what we sense. And so language of sense perception becomes very, very predominant in the nomenclature of the day, the academic nomenclature of the day. And so Edwards would borrow that language in an effort to preach in a very apologetic way to a relatively sophisticated intellectual crowd in Northampton, Massachusetts. At that time, New York was not the center of America; it was really Boston, and so you have a very, very sophisticated, rather elitist group of people to whom he's ministering to, as well as farmers and coppersmiths and a little bit of everything else. And in fact, when he left Northampton, he went to Stockbridge and spends several years there ministering to Housatonic Indians who couldn't even speak English. But he borrowed the Lockean sense perception language of his day, the rhetoric of sensation, and he would speak of the beauty of Jesus or the sweetness of Jesus or tasting the sweetness of Jesus. And he put lyrics to the music I've been hearing my whole life about Jesus being sweet and beautiful. He speaks of the things of God. Edward speaks of the things of God being the cream of all our pleasures. I mean, who talks like that? Mm-hmm. And for me, when I think of Jesus, I don't think of a proposition, though propositional truth is crucial. And I think even the sort of the postmodern and the post-postmodern attempt to do away with propositional truth itself relies on propositions in order to claim that propositional truth is meaningless. But be that as it may, when I think of Jesus, while there's so much propositional truth that tells us who he is, he's a person. And yeah, I love him. I love him and have loved him my whole life. I don't know, he's sweet to the taste. He is beautiful to see. Edward spoke of the new sense of the heart, right? At regeneration, the Holy Spirit, we are indwelt by the Holy Spirit, who becomes for us a new sense perception. Like my eyes can see or your fingertips can touch and feel. Edward says we have a new sense or a new ability to sense, just like my tongue can taste. Now I have a new sensory ability, and that's the new sense of the heart. And I can sense the sweetness and the beauty and the delightfulness and and so forth. He would use language like Jesus being altogether lovely, or the excellency of Jesus, or the beauty of Jesus, or the sweetness of Jesus, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But a lot of those guys spoke that way. I mean, if you read Samuel Rutherford, the great Scottish Presbyterian theologian, you read his letters. My goodness, he wrote these letters about Jesus in the way that a man writes about his lover. The language of intimacy and just being ravished by the love of Jesus. We don't let ourselves feel that, man. Mm-hmm. We need to.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. If someone's listening and they're thinking to themselves, "Yeah, I love Jesus too, and I believe in Jesus," but man, that guy's how Jesus has touched that guy, and the impact and the relationship there, the love that David seems to be experiencing. I'm not sensing that, and I don't have that myself, but I want that. What would you say to them?
I would say a couple of things. Go get the letters of Samuel Rutherford. Kind of attenuate yourself to the antiquated language. Don't expect Samuel Rutherford to read like someone, coughing up a tweet, right? Let the language be what it is. And say, okay, how could somebody like Samuel Rutherford actually feel this so deeply? And read Rutherford, read Edwards. There's a host of others. Thomas Watson comes to mind, the great old Puritan. Thomas Watson comes to mind. The other thing I would say is familiarize yourself with the history of hymnody. There was a time in which Christians, if they didn't have much, they at least had a Bible and a copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs and a hymnal. And they would keep these hymnals with them at all times and just meditate on these hymns, and in their private worship, read these hymns and sing these hymns to the Lord. And so many of these older hymns are filled with such intimate language. What language can I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend? There are lines in hymns that will just unravel me. Mm-hmm. Just unravel me. So, I'll try not to think of them here because I'll probably wind up crying again. And but that I would say things like that. Mm-hmm. And at a certain level, man, there's not a lot in our society and a lot in our culture right now. I mean, we're all running pillar to post. We're more connected than we've ever been. Like right now, I curate probably 8 different email accounts. You can reach me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You can send up smoke signals. You can call me, right? Whatever. We are all so connected, but we all feel so exhausted and lonely, right? Was it 2018 in the UK? Tracy Crouch was appointed by the British government to be a minister or a government official for that which is considered to be the number one problem of middle-aged men. You say, what's the number one issue with middle-aged men? Everybody thinks porn. Yeah, porn's a symptom. The number one problem for middle-aged men is loneliness. And the UK appointed a minister, not like a clergyman, but a minister, a government official, to tackle the problem of loneliness.
Wow.
Because of the billions of dollars that they were losing in the UK in their economy, because in the workforce, people struggling with loneliness, having to take time off, dealing with depression, dealing with mental illness, all kinds of things. And a lot of it stems from loneliness.
Wow.
So I think that is such a significant, like as a pastor, such a significant issue that I see among men. I have a Wednesday morning Bible study called Biscuits and Bibles, and it's nothing sexy. It's just we have sausage and biscuits, and we go through the word line by line, expository teaching. But those men come there, a lot of them, they stumble in broken, bruised, a mess. And what they really are is lonely. Whatever they've gotten themselves into, whatever they've stepped in, whatever they've been caught doing, it is a result oftentimes of just loneliness. And loneliness can be a very wearying thing.
Absolutely. What year was that the UK had the Crouch as minister?
2018,
relatively recently. One thing I stumbled across just in the last couple of months that they're doing in the UK, it's called social prescribing. Have you heard of that?
I've not.
Yeah, you can go to the doctor and they will prescribe for you basically a social interaction. That could be a hike. It could be a garden experience. In Canada, they did a test, I think it was 2018, that they gave away 50 free Museum of Art tickets for people that had health issues. And they were testing, like, let's get some of these people in a fine arts museum and see what kind of impact this has. And I don't recall, the article that I was reading didn't say how that turned out with those 50 free tickets. But the idea of loneliness in the UK taking it seriously is backed up by this social prescribing thing as well. What are your daily cadence? What's your daily cadence with the Lord and the Word and prayer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my days can be rather chaotic because I teach teenagers. Right? So I teach apologetics to teenagers most days, and teenagers have needs and there are issues, and there's a certain kind of how would I say it? Kind of a sort of serendipity that you have to just get used to, and which fits my personality.
Well, I was just going to ask, do you enjoy that interaction with teenagers?
Very, very much.
Okay.
Very, very much. I mean, like, I am not one of these, overly committed to the Enneagram kind of people, but for whatever value the Enneagram has, I am not an Enneagram 1, as you've probably seen trying to get me here, pin me down for an interview. I'm a 4. I'm an artist. I'm a whatever. And so I love spur of the moment. I love improv. I love people. I love that which is part of what's made the last 6 months so difficult, right?
Sure.
I mean, if you think about, we're all trying to avoid a virus, and there's such a deep need that we all have that Zoom only seems to medicate for so long.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And that is that tactile being with each other. And why is that? It's because we're created Imago Dei. You mentioned Sam Harris a second ago, and Sam Harris says that at the end of the day, we are all biochemical puppets. Okay, so from his worldview standpoint, as brilliant as he is, and he is brilliant, but from his worldview standpoint, there's really no difference between you and that slug on the sidewalk out there. You're just more advanced at the cellular level, right? But you're both just flesh machines, biochemical puppets. There's no dignity, there's no actual freedom or anything like that. But if we are, as Scripture says, created in the image of God, and God has from all eternity existed in community, no wonder loneliness is an issue when we cannot have that tactile, right? It is a cry of the Imago Dei in us. It's not some utilitarian Darwinian survival mechanism. It is a cry of the Imago Dei in us, which cannot be suppressed, right? And so we've got to have it. I love that tactile. I love being with students. I love my study is called the Hobbit Hole, and it's this massive library. Somewhere around probably 7,000 volumes in there, and it's set up as you walk in. It's very Tolkien-esque, and the kids love to come in there. I've got this Gandalf action figure, and he's saying, "You shall pass," instead of "You shall not pass."
Is this at your house?
Yeah, the kids love. This is at the school, at the
school,
academy.
okay.
Yeah, and so the kids love to come in there, and they just love to hang out and be in the Hobbit Hole and be surrounded by all the books and everything. But part of it is just so that I have the opportunity to interact, and they can kind of come into my world in there.
I see.
And so, yeah, I do love that tactile interaction.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I try to make sure, as pedantic as it can probably be at times, is follow a Bible reading plan. My partner in crime at the academy, I'm overseeing the spiritual life department, and we have a young lady named Beth Graham, who is a student at Westminster Theological Seminary in their online program, and she is my assistant. And then my fellow pastor, Arnil Strain, who is a black brother pastor who is doing so much to help us think through issues of diversity and that kind of thing from the standpoint, as I like to say, not from the kind of shifting trends of social ideologies, but the stable trajectory of kingdom priorities.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big difference there.
That's well put.
Right?
Yep.
So we were as a team there, but Beth has put together a wonderful Bible reading plan. And this year she put together a Bible reading plan that is on the theme of we are the people of the new Exodus, kind of that biblical theological theme that we are following the new and better Moses, Jesus, through the Red Sea crossing of his crucifixion, and now we are pilgrims and strangers, kind of the themes of Hebrews and 1 Peter. And so the whole Bible reading plan is around that theme of the already and the not yet. We're not home yet. We are pilgrims and strangers. So I follow that Bible reading plan closely. I keep by my chair some hymnals, and I will meditate on hymns, sing hymns to the Lord. By myself, I'll sing hymns to the Lord, because here's the thing, man. if what Scripture tells us in places like Hebrews 12 and 13, even if we're just worshiping the Lord in private, it's a huge crowd because we have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, and we are surrounded by the myriad of hosts in their festal gatherings. And so in some ways, I'll just be by myself and sing hymns to the Lord. Hymnody is very important to me. And look, I love cheesy praise choruses too, because I'm kind of cheesy myself. So I'm not one of those kind of snooty, you can only listen to hymns if they're written by people who have already gone on to be with the church triumphant. No, I love cheesy praise choruses and so forth. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with repetition. Sometimes people will say, well, these praise choruses, they're 7-11 songs, 7 words repeated 11 times. Well, and it's true. It's true. Some of them are.
They're not completely wrong all the time.
Not completely wrong on that. But if you think about the Psalms, right? In the Psalms, one of the hallmarks of Hebrew poetry, Hebrew literature, they couldn't underline things or embolden words, and so there would be repetition. It's called parallelism. And so I think there's an important thing to repetition, parallelism, but I digress. Anyway, I told you I was an Enneagram 4, so here I am bouncing all over the place. Squirrel. So, but I'll read through hymns, sing hymns to the Lord, and that's a very theological thing. During the Protestant Reformation, Rome did not fear the massive Latin theological treatises of Luther and the magisterial reformers. What they feared, though, more than anything, were their hymns and catechisms, because many of the peasants, they couldn't even read to begin with, but they could memorize what they heard. They could memorize what they would sing. And so the thing that really caused the gates of hell to tremble during the Protestant Reformation were not the big, thick theology books. It was the hymns, because the milkmaids and the coppersmiths who could not read a word of German were memorizing deep theology by singing it over and over and over.
Yeah, and that's how Jesus said the kingdom of God would go out too. I mean, that's like, wow.
Yeah,
I never knew that.
Yeah, so I'll use hymnody. That great little prayer book, Valley of Vision.
Mm-hmm.
My Valley of Vision is so marked up and tattered, and I keep it. It's in my bag down here right now. It's with me at all times. Yeah. And then I have other collections of prayers that I will read. I love reading the prayers of the giants and giantesses upon whose shoulders we stand. Elizabeth Prentice comes to mind. Charles Spurgeon's The Pastorate Prayer, that little volume of his pulpit prayers. I mean, it will lift you into the very throne room of heaven itself. When you read, and I think it's important that we mix into our own sort of devotio, our devotional lives, the prayers of others, because we learn how to pray because that's what the book of Psalms is. If somebody has a problem reading the prayers of others, then you're going to have a problem reading the book of Psalms, because the book of Psalms is a collection of songs, prayerful songs, prayers set to music, lyrical prayers. And so I think there's a lot to be had. And so I mix a lot of that into my own devotional walk. And then I'm always reading. I read a lot. And yeah.
Do you read almost every night? Do you watch any TV? Do you watch some TV? What's your evenings look like?
I don't watch a lot of TV. However, I will say this. I've never understood binge watching on Netflix. Everybody talks about it, and I'm thinking, good grief, I don't have time to watch anything on TV. However, a couple of years ago, I understood how binge watching worked. I watched a show on Netflix called Daredevil.
Haven't seen it.
It's the kind of thing where finally I understood. I'm so out of it, right? I finally understood when people talk about binge watching, because, you get to the end of the episode and it says your next episode is starting in 5, 4. I'm like, well, heck, I'm already halfway through the next episode. I might as well stay and watch it, right? And then when I would be over, I'd have watched 3 or 4 episodes. And then the other one was Stranger Things. I can tell you, Daredevil and Stranger Things, I crossed over. But no, I don't watch much TV. I consume a fair amount of news and commentary online, podcasts, a lot of that online. I'll sit on my deck at night and have a little bourbon and a cigar and just consume that way. But I read every day. Every day.
Okay. So are you, what do you do to turn your mind off to get to sleep? Do you read and then just go to sleep? Or do you do something to create some sort of a turn that thing off?
My wife would tell you my mind's never turned off. She jokes about this because sometimes I'll say, "Hey, baby, what are you thinking?" She'll just say, "Nothing." I'll be like, "No, really, what are you thinking?" She said, "No, I'm blank right now. I can't." My mind never ever stops, and she says your mind exhausts me because it's just now. It's not because I'm so smart. It's just I'm like I don't know. I can't control it, and I'm just.
It's also because
it wears
you're
me
so
out
smart.
too.
Let's just be honest.
And it wears me out too. It really does. I like to fall asleep praying. And people might say, well, that's very disrespectful to God. I'm like, no, man, it's just me falling asleep in my Father's arms, you know? I think to fall asleep praying, just to be, I don't think God is offended by that. I think it's kind of like, he's like, receiving our prayers and we're praying and he's just like, okay, my son, my daughter, you go to sleep. You go to sleep now. We'll pick up tomorrow.
So you'll read, Andrew, can you grab that box up there that says the key to success is hard work? My dad made that box. He passed away when I was 10. I want to show you a couple cigars in there, and I'd love to smoke one if you care to.
Right now?
Yeah. You have enough time?
Oh, my goodness.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Are you kidding me?
I want to show you this, my new favorite cigar from my friend Fadi Bousamra. He's the chief investment officer of Nashville's pension fund. Nashville's pension fund, just in case you didn't know, is performing top 1% in the country for the last 5 or 7 years. And
incredible.
He turned me on to these things, and they are fantastic.
Is this one of the underheads?
It's
the
undercrowns.
Undercrowns.
Yeah.
Underheads. Undercrowns.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of crowned heads. You're probably familiar with the crowned heads. The undercrowns are, this is such a delight.
Yeah,
oh, my goodness.
They're great.
I didn't know I was going to get to smoke a cigar.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
I wouldn't have been so hard to book if I'd have known that.
All right, now we know for next time, Andrew.
You'd be like, why is this guy knocking on our door again wanting to be interviewed?
Oh, man, I love a good cigar. How often are you smoking a cigar? Every night?
I smoke pretty consistently. Most nights, yeah. I'll go out on the deck and I will. I'll have a little bourbon.
Okay.
And I'll listen to some lectures or a sermon, or I'll read, and I'll just.
Grab that box right there when you get your hand free too, and we'll use that for our ash. With a little race car on it. Just take that race car off and just open the lid of that box, and we'll use that to put our ash in.
This has turned into a great day. Let me tell you.
Absolutely. This is my favorite way to light cigars too, by the way. There's nothing like a good blowtorch. It gets the job done.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, there's something about a good cigar with some bourbon in the evening.
There's nothing like. Well, you asked what I do to kind of settle down. That's what I do to settle down.
Okay, all right.
But usually when I'm doing that, I'm praying and reading the scripture and kind of drift off.
What did your parents do?
My dad was older when he had me. He was 42, I believe, when he had me, 43. And my mom was 11 years younger than he was. And
oh, wow. You got it? Oh, yeah.
Am I going?
Yeah, you are.
All right. So my dad was in the Pacific Theater, World War II. He worked a 3-man anti-aircraft gun, lost his hearing because of it. It was a gun that had a man on one side turning a crank that turned the gun left and right, and a man on the other side that turned a crank that made it go up and down.
Oh, my
And
gosh.
then one man would feed the bullet belt through the gun, and so they all kind of took turns in those positions. He lost his hearing pretty much because of it. His whole life, he was a mechanic at Filson's Amoco, and it later became Filson's Gulf. They're on Tier 31 in Lebanon, Tennessee. And so from the time I was 9 years of age, I started working with him, what we called watching the front. Because back in those days, you didn't have like little convenience stores. You had gas stations, and people would pull up.
Wait, working the front.
Where?
Where?
It's called watching the front at the service station.
Oh, okay.
So people would show up, and they would pull up to the gas pumps, and you'd run out, and you would check their oil, you check their tires.
I see.
You would wash their windshield, and so I did that for years until I got a little bit older and started doing some light mechanic work, tune-ups, started doing brake jobs, different things, just learning there with my daddy. And my daddy had a 4th grade education and had to leave school to go working with his father in the lumber yards out in Lebanon. He did that through his teenage years, and then he was drafted and went to the Pacific Theater in World War II.
So not particularly educated. How about your mom?
My mama had a high school education, and when they met, she was working in a boot factory in Lebanon. And so neither of them were particularly, educated formally.
Were they bookworms? Did they love to read? Or?
My mama, after my daddy died, when my daddy got sick, and she became his full-time caregiver, with he had Alzheimer's. The two things that she did to sort of content herself while watching him, she would watch the Atlanta Braves baseball, and she would read. And so she became a voracious reader at the end of her life, or toward the end of my dad's life. And so I would say for the last 15 years of her life, she became a voracious reader. And I remember one year when we gave her for Christmas, we gave her a Kindle. You would have thought we had just given her the keys to a brand new Mercedes or something. She loved that Kindle so much. My dad was not a voracious reader of books, but I grew up every morning, the first sound that I heard in the morning when I would wake up was the gentle sound of the leaves of his Bible turning, because his chair was on the other side of the wall. And I would wake up and I would hear him just turning the pages. Every morning he would read his Bible. So here he is with a fourth grade education, and he would read that Bible. And so that's a memory and an image that for which I'm profoundly grateful. Now, the most voracious reader in our family, though, hands down, is my wife. She outreads me by a mile.
Oh, really?
She's always reading.
So in the evening when you're out with your bourbon and cigar, reading or watching some lectures or listening to a podcast or whatever you're doing there, mostly reading, she is reading alongside you?
Yeah, she'll come out.
Okay.
Depending on how strong the cigar I have at that moment is. But she tolerates it pretty well.
She doesn't care for it?
She won't let me smoke them in the house.
Okay.
That
seems like a fair.
Yeah, you don't. Yeah, you learn quickly what your boundaries are.
Sure.
As a husband, and that's definitely one of them.
Yeah. I mean, my wife, she would never let me smoke a cigar in the house. She has grown to tolerate it. Her grandfather wasn't a nice man, and he smoked a lot of cigars. He was an Amish man, and she kind of has a distaste for the smell. I kind of like the smell, but in here, it's all concrete.
Yeah.
And we can smoke in here. There's no smoke alarms that are going to go off or anything like that.
This is delightful.
But yeah, this is wonderful. This is great to share this moment with you.
Underground. Oh my goodness gracious! Thank you.
So good. It's fascinating to me that with your intellectual horsepower and coming from, and then not necessarily you carrying on that from your parents. Your parents didn't have PhDs. Your parents weren't college educated. I mean, it seems like a bit of an anomaly to me.
I suppose so. I think my parents were both in their own right very smart people. My mama was the quickest witted person. I mean, she was a spicy meatball, let me tell you. She was a very quick-witted person, hilarious, and the most compassionate person I've ever known. The most compassionate human being that I have ever known was my mama. And my dad was much the same way, simple man though, but I think he saw enough in the war that he didn't tell me about until I was older. And he started describing some of the things that he witnessed firsthand in the Pacific Theater that are barbaric, and how you ever process those things, I'll never know, but I think they both felt like, because they had both been married before and had some pretty rough situations that they came out of, especially my mama, poor thing. And I think when I came along in September 26, 1966, when I was born, I think they sort of viewed me as, I don't know how else to say it. I think they sort of viewed me as sort of a redemptive opportunity. And it was interesting because when my dad was so sick And he 3 months before he died, my son was born. And we thought we were going to lose my mama because she was so worn out trying to take care of him. And then my son was born, and I think Luke just kind of became, humanly speaking, her savior, if that makes sense. And the Lord used Luke to kind of take her through the last few months of my dad's life and so forth. But I remember when I left for seminary in St. Louis, the night that we had my going away party, and the U-Haul truck was was there and getting ready to load up all my stuff so I could move to St. Louis. And I knew we didn't know what was wrong with my dad, but we just knew he was getting older. We didn't know that he had Alzheimer's. Now looking back on it, and I've done for the last 20 years, we do a nursing home ministry every single Sunday at an Alzheimer's nursing home. Of course, with COVID, we've not been able to for the last few months. But before that, my kids were raised there as babies at this Alzheimer's facility in Bellevue. And we just go in, love on them, and preach a little 2-minute sermon, sing old hymns. And they don't remember who they are. They don't even remember you from week to week necessarily, but you go in and love on them, hold their hands, and just sing hymns and recite the 23rd Psalm with them. And so Alzheimer's been a big part of my life. It's funny. One time we were in there, and this lady wheels herself in on her walker, and she walks up to me and she goes, and this is while I'm preaching, she says, "You look like Tom Selleck." And in my book, that's a plus. Tom Selleck, what the heck? Anyway,
that is funny.
Hilarious.
And in her book, though,
and in her book,
that's a plus. That's so funny. Yeah. You mentioning hearing your dad turn the pages of his Bible reminds me of something Ray Ortlund said one time. He said that you can't live with a man of God without walking in on some pretty great moments.
Yeah.
And he was talking about his dad.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's so true, And what I love about that statement, it's a typical Ray statement because it doesn't just communicate a message. It causes me to think, oh, have my kids walked in on any great moments? Okay. If not, am I a man of God? What should I do about that? You know what I mean? Like it's both, it communicates a message, it's inspiring, and it causes you to kind of have do a little inward check,
a little heart inventory, as the Puritans would speak of. Self-examination.
So when you agreed to be on the podcast, which I was thrilled about, at some point I texted Ray and asked him what I should, of all of the many, many topics we could get into here, what I should definitely get into with you. And he said to ask you how the Bible can make us better people. So why would he want me to ask that, and why do you think the Bible can make us better people?
I think the reason Ray would want you to ask that is because Ray, probably more than anybody I've ever known, loves the Bible. That man, he is just crazily in love with the Bible. I don't know anybody that loves the Bible more than Ray Ortlund. And so, I think probably the reason he's asking that is because he has this childlike. Here you have this man himself, a PhD in Old Testament. I think a storied ministry and fruitfulness that can't be denied, and yet he has this childlike love for the Bible. Yes, that's the book from me. And I think that's one of the things. You say on my daddy, he was not a particularly educated man, but I woke up every morning listening to him turn the pages of the Bible. And as I was saying, when I was about to leave for seminary, I knew he was getting older, and I thought, okay, I can't. And I had this moment where I can't leave. I can't leave Nashville and go to St. Louis. And my mama said to me, she got a hold of me and just kind of shook me, and she said, "No, you were born for this." She looked me right in the face. She said, "You were born for this. Your daddy and I'll be okay. I'll take care of him. You were born for this." And I think that sprung out of a love for the Bible that just changes everything in our lives. And so how does the Bible help us be better people? Well, I think the first way that it helps us is it tells us that we are not good people. So that the first way it helps us to become better people is it shows us something of our nature. Jeremiah 17, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can understand it? or, Romans 1:18-32, where we traded the truth of God for a lie. Our epistemology has become darkened. I mean, that's what it's saying when it says our foolish hearts are dark and our thinking is futile. That's an epistemological statement, right? We've traded the truth of God for a lie. We've suppressed the truth out of our pre-commitment to wickedness. Or, Romans 3:10-18, there is no one who seeks God. There is no fear of God before our eyes. Our throats are open grave. Our feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark our way. The poison of vipers is on our lips. Or, Romans 5:9-10, where it says we are at enmity with God, or Ephesians 2:1-3, where it says we are walking around like zombies. We're dead men walking. We're like zombies. We're like extras on the set of The Walking Dead in Ephesians 2:1-3. So the Bible tells us that left to ourselves, in and of ourselves, our nature is fallen, and we are desperately helpless and desperately hopeless in and of ourselves. And then it tells us then of our need for somebody to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. And so it shows us our predicament, but then it shows us our provision, and our provision's a person, and that's Christ. Mm-hmm. And so I think the way the Bible helps us become better people is it tells us of the gospel, the regenerative work of the Holy Spirit in our lives, such that as we read in Psalm 119, the law becomes our love affair. The law of God becomes a love affair for us. I mean, just go read Psalm 19, which is kind of the blurb for Psalm 119. And, in Psalm 19, we see, your word, O Lord, is sweeter than honey, and the drippings of the honeycomb. You think about it, more to be desired than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey, and the drippings of the honeycomb. I had a friend at our church about 4 years ago, because I'd always talk about the word being sweeter than the drippings of the honeycomb. He says, have you ever had honey right out of the honeycomb? And I said, no. He said, well, come over. He keeps bees, and he has what he calls his kitchen in the basement where he harvests all the honey. And he carved off a piece of honeycomb. It was very waxy. And he said, it was really warm because of all the vibration of the wings of the bees. And so it was really warm.
Really? The honeycomb is warm when you pull it out?
Oh, when you pull it out, it is almost hot. I mean, and so he says,
that's fascinating.
He said he carved off a piece. He said, here, suck on this. And I sucked the honey out of the honeycomb, and it devolved me into heights of palatable ecstasy, the likes of which has only been matched by this cigar right here. So it was incredible. So to think of, that is Edwardsian sensory language, the law becoming so sweet to you. So I think the Bible, because of the regeneration of the Holy Spirit, or what Edwards would call the new sense of the heart, we now have a love affair with the Word. But then what the Word tells us is that the same grace that justifies us, say Titus 2:11 and following, is the same grace that sanctifies us. And so you read, go back to Ephesians 2. So you see there in the first 3 verses of Ephesians 2, but as for you, you were dead. Nekros is the Greek word. And that word, in the Greek, you know what it literally means? It means you were dead. And you were dead in your trespasses and sins. You're spiritually dead. You were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, the prince of the power of the air, who is now at work in the sons of disobedience. You walked among these, carrying out the cravings of the flesh, and were like the rest of mankind, children of wrath. It's a very bleak picture. But then you have in verse 4, the gospel in a nutshell. 3 words in Greek, 2 in English. But God, hadatheos in Greek. But God. The whole Bible is really a but God book. Mm-hmm. So to raise the question, how does the Bible help us become better people? It's because the Bible is a but God book. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses and sins, made us alive together with Christ. See, when were we made alive? When we were dead. Even when we were dead in trespasses and sins, He made us alive together with Christ, raised us and seated us with Him in the heavenly places. By grace you've been saved through faith. And that is not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. And then in verse 10, for we are His workmanship. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus, prepared for good work, created for good works, prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. And so the Bible tells us, here is your predicament, here is the provision. You, when you were dead, were raised. You have been made alive. You who were dead, you're like extras on the set of The Walking Dead. You're zombies walking around, spiritually dead. You have now been united to the truly alive one who is Christ. And just like when you plug a guitar amp into the wall, it's got to come on. When you're plugged into Christ, you got to come alive, right? He is our life, which is why Paul says in Colossians, Christ is your life, right? It's not when Paul says in Colossians 3, Christ is your life, he's not just saying that Christ is a hobby you're into or something that really matters to you. He's saying he is now your very ontic existence. He is now your ontology now is Christ himself. Your very being, your life is Christ. My wife, when we were dating, she had this shirt, this T-shirt that said "Hockey is life, everything else is details." And she used to go see the St. Louis Blues. I think she kind of had this kind of fantasy that she would one day marry this tall, rugged, kind of athletic guy. She settled, obviously, but anyway, it's not that Christ is your life in the sense of he's a club you've joined. He is your very ontic existence now. And so Paul says in Ephesians 2, then, you have been made alive together with Christ. Now, it's not just that you've been regenerated, but you're now being renewed. And so you've been justified, but now you are in the process of sanctification. All of it's by grace. And when Paul says we are his workmanship, there in verse 10 of chapter 2 of Ephesians, that word workmanship is the word poema. Poema. We go from dead men walking to poetry in motion.
Is that what poema means?
Poema, we get our word poem from it. Poema, it means workmanship. It means craftsmanship.
Wow.
People craft a poem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, now I've been talking so much, my light has gone out.
You.
Rescue me from my predicament.
I got you.
Be my provision here for this.
Where's this flicker right here?
And so I think the Bible creates within us an appetite, or the Holy Spirit creates within us an appetite for the Word of God, for the law of God, such that the law becomes our delight, right? And when we realize that the law no longer condemns us because it's condemned Christ instead of us, because the law of God crushes lawbreakers or Christ in their stead, right?
Yes.
Now the law doesn't condemn us. It calls us to conformity to Christ. And here's the thing. If you think about, like, say, the history of ideas, and this is one of the things I love about Jonathan Edwards. So Jonathan Edwards wrote a lot about ethics. He wrote Charity and Its Fruits, and these were basically sermons he was preaching to his congregation. But everything Edwards did, and again, his period 1703 to 58, everything that Edwards did was with an apologetic thrust, because the Enlightenment was coming across the Atlantic. So you have to understand Edwards in his transatlantic context. And one of the things that was going on over there, because the Enlightenment, say after Immanuel Kant, the Copernican revolution in knowledge in the mid-1700s, with the beginning of the Enlightenment that's coming across the Atlantic, and deism was on the rise. And everybody thinks, well, deism was just, the absentee clockmaker. God winds up the clock, creates certain mechanical laws, and he goes away. That's an aspect of deism, but deism was much more than that. And so deism had to answer not just for the existence of God, but how do we account for morality? And so you had the rise of what was known as the British moral sense school, that said that man could be moral apart from special revelation. We don't need the Bible in order to be morally responsible creatures. We simply observe natural law and of our own autonomous reason deduce what constitutes morality. And that sounds noble on the front end, but basically it's just same song, different verse of the garden. Ye shall be as gods, knowing for yourself what is good and evil. In other words, you'll make your own rules about right and wrong. And so that comes across the Atlantic. And look, let's admit, many of our founding fathers were deists. And one of the things to which they were committed was the idea that man can be principled, he can be moral, not because he is depending on the Bible or this idea of God revealing what morality is, but he observes nature and through his own autonomous reasoning deduces what morality ought to be. Well, the history of the world is example after example after example of bloodshed and abuse and violence when man tries to be good apart from God. Right? You go back to Sam Harris. If Sam Harris says all we are biochemical puppets, how do you account for morality in an atheistic worldview?
Yeah, yeah. And that's what presuppositional apologetics is kind of all about, right? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mm-hmm. In many ways, yeah.
I was curious what your thoughts would be on how the Bible would inform today, but that's a very broad question, and I want to touch on Jonathan Edwards too. So let me ask the question this way. If Jonathan Edwards would stop by, maybe take a tour of the country or just kind of, become abreast of the situation, what do you think his thoughts would be to the church?
Yeah. I think Edwards was very prophetic. In 1746, he wrote a treatise entitled Religious Affections. And in the Religious Affections, he is trying to delineate at the time the revival, the First Great Awakening, that was really sparked. And you think about the First Great Awakening, you think of figures like George Whitefield and so forth. But Edwards really, in many ways, sparked the First Great Awakening with a series of 5 lectures on the doctrine of justification by faith alone in 1734. And that sparked the First Great Awakening in the Connecticut Valley area, and then it spread out from there. By 1740, George Whitefield has come over, and the First Great Awakening is just spreading like a wildfire. It's just spreading. And everybody's getting saved, and everyone is converting to Christ. And Edwards, though, is also looking at that and saying there appear to be false professors. This seems to be for some just sort of an emotional kind of thing they're getting caught up in. And so how do we delineate true conversion from false conversion? How do we see the real fruit-bearing effects of revival? So in 1746, he writes Religious Affections, and I say that to say, I think he would say, just go back and if he came and looked at the contemporary church today, he'd say, y'all need to go back and read Religious Affections, because one of the things about Religious Affections is it talks about the things that are requisite for true revival to have taken place, requisite for true Christianity to be in place. Things like Christians are possessed of what he calls that lamb-like, dove-like spirit and temper of Jesus Christ. He talks about the place of holiness among believers. And so I think he would look at the church today and say that in many ways we've lost our first love. Mm. And I think in our day of celebrity pastors giving themselves over, desperately trying to build a platform and become influencers and thought leaders rather than physicians of the soul. The old Puritan idea of a pastor being a physician of the soul. Mm-hmm. Ferguson once said the Puritans were not just physicians of the soul, but they were also pharmacists of the conscience. They knew which shelf to go to get the right medicine. Oh, right? Wow. They were physicians, but they knew which shelf to go to take the right medicine, to the right salve to put on the wounds of their people. And so I think he would look at pastors and say, okay, you've built platforms, but do you know the lay of your sheep's wool? Do you know the lay of your sheep's wool? Do you know them? I think he would ask pastors, are you covered in sheep poo? Because if you're going to, sheep are messy creatures, man. You're going to get covered in it, right? Mm-hmm. I think he would wonder if the church truly has had an encounter with and an understanding of the nature of God. Mm. So, and the nature of God and the person of Christ. I think I'd said before we got started, I think at the end of the day, most heresies can be traced back to issues regarding the nature of God and the nature of Christ. The nature and not just the person of Christ, but the work of Christ. Mm-hmm. For instance, the whole issue of the new perspectives, which you don't hear a whole lot about that anymore, but the new perspectives on Paul from, say, the early to mid-2000s, we think it was an issue over justification and imputation. Really what was at stake there was a reconfiguring of the nature of the atonement, what was actually accomplished in the atonement. But of course, if you mess around with the atonement, you do away with penal substitutionary atonement, you're not going to have imputation. If you don't have imputation, you're not going to have a biblical definition of justification. Justification is going to be redefined corporately as some sort of sociological thing, which is what the new perspectives movement actually did. And so you trace that back to the work of Christ, or you look at the various heresies and cults that have developed over the years. It usually has something to do with the person of Christ, the nature of Christ, or the doctrine of God. And so I think Edwards would look at the church today and invite us to revisit a robust theology, what's called a theology proper, or the doctrine of God. Because as the old statement goes, God created man in his image, and we've been returning the favor ever since. Just, okay, look, I'm not going to give God an image overhaul. I'm going to try to understand the nature of God as he's revealed himself and let that undo me.
Let's not pass over that. You said we've been created in the image of God and we've been trying to return the favor ever since. Mm-hmm. Do you mean that we often view God as a really great human, essentially? Yeah, and we're not putting him in the right category of God with a capital G? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think that. I think we view God as, and this is because we're all postmodernists. All of us are. We've all breathed in the air of it, and we are desperately trying to escape it. So at a certain level, postmodernism has impacted all of us, and what that means for, say, objectivity and predication. And if we follow, say, philosophers like Richard Rorty in a communitarian hermeneutic, or Ludwig Wittgenstein or Jacques Derrida, et cetera, or even if you consider, say, the French philosophers like Michel Foucault or Jean-Francois Lyotard, the idea of objectivity and predication just goes out the window. And if that's the case, and then I can kind of impregnate words with whatever meanings I want them to have. And so when we apply that to something like God, we redefine him in a way that's convenient for us,
Yes.
or a way that's useful for us.
Yes. If Edwards was giving advice, do you think it would be one or the other, or a combination of two, which is what America needs right now is Christians on fire from God. We need a revival.
Mm-hmm.
And we also need those revived Christians to get involved in governmental leadership and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Would he touch on that at all, you think, or would the focus just be on revival?
It's a great question. And historically, the answer can be seen in the fact that Edwards, as a minister in Northampton, and again, his date 1703 to 58, the minister was not viewed as this sort of sideline guy over here. The pastor in the colonies at the time was viewed as a very socially pertinent individual. And so Edwards would not have been a politico. I'm not saying that Edwards would have supported kind of the 1980s kind of moral majority kind of culture war kind of thing, but he would not have been able to conceive of the minister or of Christians not being involved in the cultural conversation.
I see.
Yeah.
Fascinating. You mentioned Richard Rohr in passing. Did you just mention him?
Rorty.
Richard Rorty. Okay.
But I can talk about Richard Rohr. But Richard Rorty was he held to communitarian hermeneutics and so forth.
I've been hearing about Richard Rohr some. Is that a trustworthy source?
No, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, and I don't mean to lack compassion, but no. It was John Calvin who said that a shepherd has to have two voices, one with which to gather in the sheep and the other with which to ward off the wolves. And I know that Richard Rohr right now, a lot of people are reading him and finding comfort and solace and insight and so forth. But at the end of the day, I am not going to be faithful as a minister if I do not say there are in the church those who, through plausible sounding arguments, lead people astray. Richard Rohr is in some ways a pinnacle sort of postmodern pluralist. I think he's more Buddhist than he is anything else. And I don't mean to disrespect Buddhism, but just like I was saying earlier, call it what it is so that we can actually have the conversation.
I see.
So that there's not confusion. And no, Richard Rohr is not ultimately a trustworthy source, because it gets back to how does the Bible help us be better people? It comes down to one of two things. Am I being turned inward to some sort of self-actualization? That's just Gnosticism. That's the Gnosticism that was born in the Garden of Eden. Right? I'll reach some higher esoteric knowledge or esoteric state of being. I will become my own God. I will determine for myself what is right or wrong. Call it what it is, self-actualization or whatever. The Bible helps us be better people by turning us not to ourselves, but to our Savior. And that is not what Richard Rohr does.
Okay, so you would probably know the arguments against that much better than I. With my very preliminary understanding here, I'm thinking one of the things you would hear from Richard Rohr proponents is that I get what you're saying, David, but you're coming from a Western-influenced version of Christianity, and Rohr is coming from a more Eastern-influenced Christianity. Is that a fair criticism they would have of your statements? And if so, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I would say two things to that. That would be the obvious statement that would be...
Would it? Okay.
And it's kind of a tired old trope that's trotted out. David, you're white, you're coming from a Western kind of post-Enlightenment. The first thing I would say is, so are you. Whether you want to admit it or not, so are you, and so is Richard Rohr. The fact that he's coming from an Eastern perspective, however, does not thereby make it right or useful. Because one of the things is at the heart of an Eastern epistemology and an Eastern ethic is a turn inward towards Gnosticism and pantheism. And so just because somebody's coming from an Eastern perspective is not itself an argument against the invalidity of a Western perspective. Both Eastern and Western perspectives have to be weighed and analyzed in light of Scripture. Now, if someone is saying, well, you're coming from a Western perspective and you're so locked up in logic and propositional truth and that kind of thing. And I'm going to say, well, even to make that argument against me, you are assuming the validity of propositional truth. So in some ways, it's a bit of a red herring. It's a bit of a red herring, and we always have to go back to a scriptural epistemology when we're looking at worldviews, because really that argument or that response would be asserting kind of a juxtaposition of worldviews. You know, the idea of worldview or Weltanschauung, which is the German word for worldview. You first see it in Immanuel Kant. A Weltanschauung, which is a viewing of the world, and so a worldview, say, consists of really of a lot of things, right? Our worldview touches on everything, how we view everything from aesthetics to whatever. But a worldview consists primarily of 5 main pieces of the worldview puzzle. Theology, right? The God question. Is there a God? Who is God? Is it me? Is it someone else? Right? That's going to be answered very differently with Richard Rohr and someone like myself. And I mean no disrespect to him. But we're going to answer that very, very differently. The God question. Is there a God? Who is God? What is God like? Has this God revealed himself, herself, or itself? You remember Dishwalla's song from the early 2000s, Tell Me All Your Thoughts on God because I really want to meet her. Or Joan Osborne back in the 90s, what if God were one of us, just a slob like one of us, just a stranger on a bus trying to make his way home like a holy rolling stone? This question of theology, the God question, anthropology, what does it mean to be human? Are we, as Sam Harris says, just biochemical puppets, flesh machines? Or are we created in the image of God, gloriously endowed with potential and dignity and destined for a redeemed future in Christ? Epistemology, how do we know what we know? Is there a basis for knowing? Am I my own basis of knowing? Is the basis of knowing Eastern, which is just letting go and sort of being lost and absorbed in Brahma or some form of that, whether it's Brahma or the Force, right? Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter, Yoda says. What is the basis of epistemology? How do I know what I know? Is there a basis for knowing? Metaphysics. What's the nature of reality? Well, those are going to be answered very differently, an Eastern and Western approach to the question of metaphysics. What is the nature of being? What is the nature of reality? Is it material or is the material illusory? Is it material and spiritual? And then finally, ethics. Is there right and wrong, and who gets to make the rules on right and wrong? And so when someone comes in and might say, well, you're just coming from a Western perspective, and we'll say, well, so are you, and we all are. So let's not pretend that because you've read a book or an article by Richard Rohr that suddenly you are now liberated from kind of the over-rationalization of some aspects of the history of Western philosophy, right? I put it this way. What I would say in that instance is let's not confuse rationalism with rationality. Because John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The Logos is the rationale of God. The second person of the Godhead is the Logos, is the rationale of God. So we are created in His image. We are unavoidably rational creatures. We are logocentric. But that's not the same thing as philosophical rationalism. And so sometimes people will bring out that Western charge as if to say, in a rather, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but a rather ignorant way of saying you are a rationalist or you're embroiled in rationalism. And that's not the case. I don't know if that kind of gets your question.
It does, yeah. It's helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that. Are you good on that? You need another? No, you're good.
I'm nursing this. I'm nursing this baby.
It's good, isn't it? There's so much flavor in there.
Undercrowns. It is so spicy. It's peppery.
Yeah, it is.
Leathery.
Yeah. Vadi was saying that the flavor in cigars comes from the wrapper. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
And so when you get a big stick, like this guy who dropped off these guidance cigars, I mean, they're big cigars, and I love to smoke these too. But Fadi's point was he does smoke it inside. He lives by himself, and he's got an air purifier. And his thought was, this doesn't throw off as much smoke, and it tastes so good. So he smokes a lot of these.
Like you've got a couple of cigars there that are Connecticut wrappers. They're going to be lighter, right? And that's why when people let their cigars dry out, and then they try to smoke them, it's like smoking a skunk's tail, because what happens when a cigar dries out, the oils kind of evaporate from the wrapper. And even if you try to get it moist again, try to re-humidify it, the oils are gone, the flavors are gone. It's like, yeah, man.
Yeah, it's past.
Yeah.
The simplicity of God.
Mhm.
Can you tell us about this? This was something that was a completely, honestly, I'd never heard of it until probably the last year and a half, and it wasn't on my radar. I was not thinking in these terms. What is the simplicity of God? Do you believe in it? And how would you describe it?
Yeah, that's a great question.
You want a little splash of this guidance, by the way? You want a taste of it?
Now, see, okay, now, I'm here. Y'all aren't going to get rid of me now, man.
Let's try. So this is Guidance Whiskey. You can buy Guidance in 43 states online. So people can buy this online, guidancewhiskey.com. He's right here in Nashville, Jason Rigel. He was just on the podcast. Wonderful guy, huge heart, and it's good whiskey.
Oh,
it's very
guide
smooth.
Guide me.
Absolutely.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes.
So before I get into the question of the simplicity of God, let me dabble.
Please.
That has a, I don't know if it's because of the cigar with it, but it has a peppery, now I'm getting the buttery.
Yeah, there is some butter in there. Cheers, my man.
Oh, my goodness. So, yes, I believe in the simplicity of God, because if I don't believe in the simplicity of God, I don't believe in God. So the simplicity of God is not a suggestion that God is simplistic,
right?
Or that he's simple in the pejorative sense, like, well, that's just a simpleton there. The Belgic Confession was a Dutch confession written in 1559, published in 1561. And so you got to kind of get your kind of understanding of the lay of the land in terms of the Protestant Reformations that were taking place. Calvin's dates are 1509 to 64. And so by the time Calvin wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Calvin was converted in 34, wrote the first edition of the Institutes in 36. And it was really just a simple treatise on the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, and the Ten Commandments. Then in 39, he puts out his second edition of the Institutes, where he focuses on union with Christ and starts to become more theologically rich and robust. In 1741, he puts out a French edition, which is a little less scholastic, a little more pastoral, and then finally the 1559 edition. So the Belgic Confession is written right in the midst of these kind of theological developments during the time of the Reformations. And I say Reformations because I know there was the Protestant Reformation, but you have to realize Reformations were always political. They always had unique qualities to them. Reformation in England, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in France, etc. But Guido de Brie wrote the Belgic Confession in 1559. 1559 is the same year that Calvin wrote his last final edition of the Institutes. It was published, the Belgic Confession, in 1561. It has 37 articles dealing with the main topics of theology and the nature of God and Christ, etc. And it's interesting, the very first line, right out of the gate, the Belgic Confession comes out and says, "We believe in our hearts and confess with our mouths one we confess a single, simple, spiritual being whom we call God." Now, a single, there's not multiple gods. There's your Eastern thing, right? You can go where I live in Bellevue to the Hindu temple there and encounter thousands upon thousands of gods. A single, simple, spiritual. Spiritual, of course, from John 4. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. But that word simple, okay, where does that come from? Well, Guido de Brie wasn't making that up. The simplicity of God is a standard feature of theology proper. You go back to Thomas Aquinas, and Aquinas, predates all those guys. Aquinas dates are 1225 to 74. And so in the Summa Theologica, he writes of the simplicity of God. And the simplicity of God simply means this. And I'll try to dispense with a lot of inflated jargon and simply say this. It means that God, in his being, is not a composite being. And this is crucial. This may seem like, oh, that's just scholastic splitting of hairs. No, it's everything. Because if we don't have this, we don't have the gospel. If we don't have this, we don't have the triune God. If we don't have the triune God, we don't have the gospel. J.I. Packer, who passed away a couple of months ago, said that the Trinity is the basis of the gospel, and the gospel is a declaration of the Trinity in action. And so we don't have the simplicity of God. We don't have the God of the Bible. Because with the simplicity of God stands or falls the eternality of God, the immutability of God, the aseity of God, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But the simplicity of God is that he is not a composite entity. Aquinas spoke of God existing a se, which is Latin for of himself. Now, everything that exists, light me up again here, man, because I don't want to do without this. These cigars right here that we're enjoying is a composite. It's a wrapper. It's a blend. For this cigar to be what it is, it must be a composite. Well, as a composite, it is not what it is if any of these pieces are missing. And as a composite, it is a dependent entity. Something had to compose it. Someone had to harvest the tobacco. Someone had to dry the tobacco and cure and age it. Someone had to expertly roll it and craft it, right? So any composite entity, take a box of Legos. If you go to McKay over there and you go into McKay used books, right when you walk in on the left, there's these huge bins of spare Lego pieces. So let's say that you get some Legos together and you create some, a vehicle or a house or some figure out of, a Lego set. Well, those Legos become a composite entity, a composite set. But they are dependent upon a number of things. They're dependent upon the design and the physics that hold them together. They are dependent upon the molecular structure of the plastics that are involved in their manufacture. They are dependent upon engineering and design, and they are dependent upon a little boy or little girl coming along, playing with them and putting them together. Well, little boy, little girl, we all like Legos, right? If God is a composite of parts, then he is suddenly dependent. And one of the things about a composite of parts, before this cigar was an entity, the components of this cigar existed. They predate the cigar that we're enjoying. The tobacco existed in seed form and then in bud form. It was being hung and cured. These parts predate the cigar itself, the entity itself. And so if God is a composite of parts, then those parts predate him and are thereby ontologically and metaphysically above him.
Sure.
They take precedent over his being. And if he's a composite of parts, not only is he not ultimate, he is also not independent. One of the most important things to stress about the character of God is his aseity, which comes from the Latin. It means the power of independent self-existence. And so the simplicity of God means that he's not, 25% wrath and 25% justice and a little splash of mercy and a whole big bucket full of love, as if he's this pie. You can this pie chart, and you can say, and here's why it's important, because most people they'll redefine God. Here's how we reimage God. We'll say, I don't want any of this business about the justice of God and the wrath of God, etc. My God is a God of love. Mainly, he's a God of love. And that comes even into, say, hermeneutics, when people will say, the God of the Old Testament was a God of wrath and he was kind of cranky, but he's mellowed with age, and by the New Testament, he's a God of love. Well, that is a denigration or denial of the simplicity of God. Aquinas spoke of God's act and being the same thing, that God is his attributes. He's not a little bit of love and a little bit of wrath and a little bit of mercy and maybe a quarter cup of grace. He is who he is entirely, perfectly, simply, not compositely, because if he is a composite of parts, then he cannot be God. Those parts that make him up precede him and take precedence over him, and he is dependent upon the conglomerating or the conglomeration of those parts in order to be who he is. And so apart from the simplicity of God, he ceases to be truly God. And so Herman Bavinck, a great Dutch theologian upon whom Van Til drew a lot of his theology, Herman Bavinck said in his Reformed Dogmatics, is the way we have it's Gear Reformed Dogmatique in Dutch. In his Reformed Dogmatics in volume 2, pages 176 and 77, he talks about the simplicity of God. And he says that if we do away with the simplicity of God and suggest that God is somehow a composite being, then we actually give up his independence and his immutability, or what's the immutability of God is the unchangeableness of God. And the immutability of God is important because you and I are mutable. We're mutable creatures, right? We can change for the better, which presupposes there was a time we were worse, or we can change for the worse, which presupposes there was a time when we were better. Mm-hmm. If God can change for the worse or for the better, he ceases to be the perfect being he is. So we give up the unchangeableness or the immutability of God. We give up the aseity or the independence of God, because God is dependent then upon these composite parts that make him up. And he's dependent upon some principle bringing those parts together, i.e., God isn't God. He's dependent upon some higher entity that can bring these parts together, and he does not exist a se of himself. And the reason that this is crucial for the gospel is because when God said in Exodus 3, Moses says, "Whom shall I say sent me?" And God says, "Tell them Yahweh is sending them. Yahweh, I am. My name is I am. I am that I am." There you have God stretching the boundaries of anthropomorphic human language to try to communicate to Moses what is ineffable. You know, that old hymn that speaks of God being ineffably sublime. Ineffable means unspeakable. When we start talking about the nature of God, we have to realize we're like a little child at the shore of an ocean trying to scoop it up with a Dixie cup, right? We're trying to find language to describe something that is so paradoxically beyond our wildest imagination. You know, theologians speak of God. You know, speak of the Latin phrase is "finitum non capax infinitum." The finite cannot comprehend the infinite. It doesn't mean that we can't apprehend. We have apprehensive knowledge, not apprehensive in that we're hesitant, but we can apprehend much about God. We can know he's revealed himself in general revelation and special revelation. But we can't have comprehensive knowledge. Finitum non capax infinitum. We cannot comprehend, because comprehensive knowledge is expert knowledge, full, complete, perfect knowledge. Well, the only being that has comprehensive knowledge of the infinite is the infinite himself. So we are running up against the bonds of human language here. But when God said, "I am that I am," you say, that's not much of an answer. Give me whom shall I say send me? I am is sending me. But that was the way that God said, "I am my own existence. I'm dependent upon nothing or no one to bring me together and put me together like you put a pie together, or like you put a set of Legos together. I am my own being. I am my own existence." And so the gospel is necessary, because if that is not who our God is, then ultimately what we consider to be salvation is going to go back to the garden. We're going to be tempted to become our own gods and take his throne. And further, when we say that the doctrine of simplicity is crucial to the gospel itself, you think about the 7 I am statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John. So beginning with chapter 8, where he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." One of the main things that got Jesus in trouble with the Pharisees were the I am statements. We think of the I am statements as just heartwarming statements. You know, "I am the bread of life," or "I am the good shepherd." And they are heartwarming, but they were scandalous statements, because every time John writes, "Ego eimi," I am, is the same language in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, when Moses says in Exodus 3, "Whom shall I say sent me?" In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, "Tell them, ego eimi, I am is sending you." So every time Jesus said, "Ego eimi," "I am the bread of life," or "I am the gate for the sheep," or "I am the good shepherd," or "I am the way, the truth, and the life," "I'm the resurrection and the life." Every time he said "I am," he was claiming to be nothing less than Yahweh, nothing less than the great I am. And in so doing, he was claiming to be independent, self-existing life. And that's the reason why, getting back to what we were saying in Ephesians 2, when we are plugged into, when we are united with Christ, we are united to the truly alive one, dependent upon nothing else for life, but the one who is very life himself. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. And is that partly what's so earth-shattering about the incarnation? And it's also why you can have Jesus as a man, composite form, not relying on anything aside from God, because he was God. And God the Father is not in composite form. and allowed or destined Jesus to become in posit form in the incarnation. Is that, am I tracking correctly there?
Yeah, so his humanity was composite, right?
Mhm.
He had flesh and bones. He was truly human and had to be. But in his essence, in his divinity, he was still simple.
Yes.
And so this is the paradox and the mystery of the incarnation, right? And it was C.S. Lewis, or his dates, 1898 to 1963. Because everybody thinks about the death of C.S. Lewis. No one realizes that the reason we don't remember the death of C.S. Lewis was it was the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dealey Plaza.
Really?
It was also the same day that Aldous Huxley died, But here you have three really competing worldviews in many ways, three men dying the same day. But C.S. Lewis said that the miracle of all miracles, those Christians actually believe God became man. And so I've already started listening to Christmas music in September, but I always start listening to Christmas music early because I want to drink in and marinate in this staggering mystery of the God-man, that Jesus is the God-man, God in flesh. Or as we read in John 1:14, you have in verse 1, he's the Logos of God, and then in verse 14, the Greek word is eskinoson. He pitched his tent. He tabernacled among us. He is the embodiment of everything that the temple setting of the garden, that the tabernacle in the wilderness, Solomon's temple, Herod's temple, everything that the temple was to be about, God dwelling with man in covenant relationship. Jesus is the embodiment of it. He templed among us. And when he took on flesh, he templed among us. He takes upon himself flesh without in any way changing in his divinity or in his divine being. So what you have here in the incarnation is, yes, a mystery, yes, a paradox, but not an essential change in the second member of the Godhead, which is why all of the formulations and the declarations, say, of the Council of Chalcedon or Nicaea are so crucial, classic Orthodox Christianity, so that and as I said earlier, all heresies end up being, most of them, some confusion around the nature of the person of Christ and the incarnation. So what you have, and that's why the language of Chalcedon is that you have the joining of the divine and the human, but not the commingling. So there were early heresies. For instance, there was Eutychianism. Eutychianism was an early heretic who said that in the incarnation, Jesus is in effect commingled, and the natures of the divine and the human are merged, and in their merging, they become a tertium quid in the Latin, a third thing, neither fully human, fully divine, but some different kind of being, this new conglomeration, not the joining of the human and the divine, but the commingling of the two. Well, if that's the case, if he's commingling, he's not then still truly God, neither is he truly human. He's something other than human. And if he's not human, then we don't have a human high priest, and we don't have salvation. The gospel's at stake. Nestorius was another heretic, and Nestorianism suggested that in the incarnation there was not even a joining. There was a separation of the human and divine. They were never joined. And so the incarnation never actually happened, in which case we don't have the gospel either. And so it's Calvin who I think is so abundantly helpful here in Book 2 of the Institutes, which is largely about Christ. If you look at Institutes 2, 12, 2, and 3. So Book 2, Chapter 12, Articles 2 and 3. He talks about the incarnation, and he says the necessity of the incarnation, of the human joining with the divine, not being commingled and not being separate, but joined, still being fully human, still being fully God, was necessary, because he says this. He talks about our state in Adam and what Adam had screwed up for us. And so Jesus had to come, and he says, in short, since neither as God alone could he fill death, nor as man alone could he overcome death, he couples the human nature with the divine, so that by the weakness of the one nature, he could fill death, and by the power of the other nature, he could overcome death for us. It's just incredible. I mean, Calvin soars at that point. So you can see how the simplicity of God, not only do you give up your theology proper and the very being of God if you deny simplicity, you end up giving up the gospel. And that's because systematic theology is like a circle of dominoes. If I set up a circle of dominoes on the table and say, flick one of them over, but don't let any others fall, if you flick one of them over, they're all going to fall. And so when we err or get off the biblical track on one particular aspect of theology, the others start to crumble as well. And so getting back to your question on Edwards, what would Edwards say if he came and looked? I think he would say you need to revisit a robust theology proper, a doctrine of God. And I think that's why the Belgic Confession so beautifully, I love even the warmth of it. We believe in our hearts and we confess with our mouth. This is not just dry, arid speculation. Our hearts are wrapped around this, that this one whom we call God is single, right? The Shema, number 6, 24 and following. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. He's single. He is spiritual, John 4. And he is simple. I am that I am, Exodus 3.
Is Jesus now in the same form that he was when he ascended? In other words, there's still a composite component to Jesus Christ, the Son of God?
Composite in the sense that his humanity is a composite of cells and bones and blood and everything else that
Yes.
we are, right? But not that he is a composite in the sense that his divinity has suddenly become pieced up and put together like Legos. But he is, yes. In other words, your question is this: does Jesus exist now at the Father's right hand in his incarnate form? So yes, the incarnation was not from all eternity in terms of its actuality. In its plan in the covenant of redemption, it was from all eternity. You know, that Jesus covenanted with the Father to become incarnate and do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. But the incarnation occurred in time-space history, as Galatians says. You know, when the time was right, Jesus was born of a woman under the law to redeem those under the law. But from that point forward, the incarnation is forever and he will never cease to be incarnate. Now, the reason that that's important is because if he is not incarnate, we have not flesh representing us at the Father's right hand. But to your question, is it the same form? Is his human form the same form? Yes and no. Yes, he's still fully human. And not only is he fully human, he is perfectly human. You see, you and I right now are truly human, but we're not fully human yet.
Yeah.
We're truly human, but we're not fully human yet. And I'll say more about that in a second. And that depends on Jesus being the perfect human now. But Jesus exists in his incarnate state. The difference, though, can be seen in a couple of things. When he was raised, and remember he says to Thomas, check me out. See these wounds right here? Put your hands there. See, a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. So he was raised no longer susceptible to death, yet he has these wounds in his physicality. Yet something about his physicality was different because they are in this locked room, scared to death, and he just appears among them. What the heck is that? So as we read in 2 Corinthians 2:9, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has it entered in the imagination, the hearts of men, the things the Lord has in store for those who love him. Who Jesus is right now would blow our freaking minds. That's why John sees him and he says, I saw the risen Christ and I fell before him like a dead man. You know? So the risen Christ is physical, yet his physicality is no longer susceptible to death. He still has those wounds. As Charles Wesley taught us to sing, 5 bleeding wounds he bears, received on Calvary. They pour effectual prayers. They strongly plead for me. Forgive him, oh, forgive, they cry. Forgive him, oh, forgive, they cry, nor let that ransom sinner die. Think about this. We're going to be in the new heaven and new earth. Unless we ever forget what got us there, we only need to look at those 5 bleeding wounds to remind us what got us there, right? So, yes, he is still in his physicality, yet when we read Romans 1:1-4, Paul says, this is the gospel of God. I'm an apostle of the gospel of God. So what is the gospel of God? And Paul gives us what is known as the Historia Salutis, the history of salvation, the life, including his incarnation, the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And he says that Jesus was raised, the Son declared to be the Son of God in power. You think, wait a second, wasn't he already declared to be the Son of God? Like even at his baptism, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Why are you saying he was declared to be the Son of God here? Well, the difference is Paul's saying he's declared now the Son of God in power. In other words, death no longer has a hold on him. All authority, Matthew 28, has been given to him. The first Adam tried to steal authority. The second Adam obeyed, and authority was given to him. He's now raised the Son of God in power, and the humanity, the physicality in which he was raised is now glorified humanity. And the good news of the gospel in that, and it gets back to what I was saying a second ago, you and I are truly human now, but we're not fully human yet. We have been united to Christ. We are in union with Christ. And in the process of sanctification, we are being conformed to Christ. And on the great and last day, 1 Corinthians 15, our bodies are going to be raised, conformed to his resurrection body. And then we will be experiencing the analogy. We will be experiencing glorified humanity ourselves. We're truly human now, but we're not fully human yet, but we're going to be, which is why Paul says in Romans, all creation is groaning under the fallout of the fall. And he says creation is in the birth pains, awaiting our adoption as sons, the resurrection of the body. Okay, wait a second. I thought I was already adopted. Yes, we're already adopted, but not yet have we experienced the full, perfect manifestation of our adoption, which is the resurrection body. So in a sense, Jesus is the first preeminent adopted son, if I can say that. He's the Son of God by nature, but he sets the paradigm for what we are going to be experiencing in the full final manifestation of our adoption, no longer susceptible to sin and death and the fallout of the fall. So the current humanity of Jesus is crucial to the gospel. It's crucial to our justification because he was raised for our justification, as Paul says in Romans 4. And he was raised the Son of God in power, glorified, which is the basis of our own glorification. So our process of sanctification is being conformed to this perfect humanity of Christ. And we're going to get there. Because Paul says in Philippians 1:6, I'm confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it through the day of completion in Christ Jesus. Right? Paul is confident that God causes our salvation, he carries our salvation, and he will complete our salvation. Or what he says in 1 Thessalonians 5:24 and following, now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. He who calls you is faithful, he will surely do it. And so the current humanity of Jesus, the resurrected and forever humanity of Jesus, is the basis of our own resurrection.
And this, now we're seeing in part why theology is so important, why right thoughts of God are so important, because we're getting a glimpse of the magnificence, the sovereignty, the power, the infinite, the beauty of God. I mean, this is, I mean, it really is like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup.
It really is. And so in many ways, the deeper you go into theology, if you're truly going deeper into biblical Orthodox theology, you are going to be going deeper and deeper into humility.
Yeah. You throw me that lighter when you get a second?
Yeah.
So back to then the simplicity of God. So that's going to be eternal. So we're not necessarily going to see God the Father, even, fast forward several billion years or whatever, the new heavens and the new earth, or next year, who knows? We're not necessarily going to see God the Father. Our view of God will be, Jesus Christ.
Great question. This is where Edwards is very helpful. So I have an article in the Encyclopedia of Jonathan Edwards, which was a cooperative work with Yale University and Erdman's publication. And they assigned me what is one of my favorite topics, known as the beatific vision, or sometimes called the beatifical vision. The beatific vision, all of the great theologians have written upon and marinated in the beatific vision. Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, etc. Calvin. Edwards, though, to me, plumbs the depths of the beatific vision, perhaps unlike any other. So the beatific vision, scripturally, where do we get this? 1 John chapter 3, verses 1 to 3. Behold, what manner of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called the children of God. What we are has not yet been revealed, and the reason the world does not know us is it did not know him. What we shall be has not yet been revealed, but we know this: when we see him, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. So a couple of things. The Trinity, the Father is Spirit. The Holy Spirit, of course, is Spirit, meaning immaterial, non-corporeal. Jesus is both metaphysically spiritual and corporeal. He is both immaterial and material. He is of the Trinity, divine in essence, the eternal Logos, immaterial, but in his incarnation, which is forever, he is material. So what we will see in our glorified bodies with our glorified eyeballs is the physical Jesus. Just think about that. That we will someday lay our eyes on Jesus. But what Edwards says is what's going on there is a seeing of God that is more intimate than any seeing with the bodily eyes can provide. So when you held up a second ago this bottle of guidance and you said, hey, do you want some of this? I saw it with my physical eyes and I beheld its beauty. And I said, yeah, pour away. We see things with our physical eyes. Yet Edwards says there is going to be an immediate meaning, and by immediate, he doesn't mean quick, like in 3 or 4 seconds, but a non-mediated seeing of God with, as it were, the eyes of our souls. We are going to know him, for our souls will see him as he is. Wait a second. That's why Paul said, now we see through a glass darkly, or through like a foggy window, but then we will see face to face. There will be an immediate seeing of our soul. Our soul will immediately, meaning in a non-mediated way, our souls will see, and in the seeing, know God as he is. So there's a reason Paul says, eye is not seen, ear is not heard, nor is it entered in the imagination the hearts of men the things God has in store for those who love him. What's held out to us in the beatific vision, frankly, changes everything. Yeah, frankly, changes. If we could wrap our heads, the Puritans talked about meditation, not in the Eastern sense, where you meditate in an effort to dissociate yourself with reality and just sort of check out. But meditation, quite the opposite, where you are honing in on and dwelling on and meditating upon theological truths. Now, imagine if Christians would simply bask in and meditate upon, even like a little kid at the shore of an ocean trying to scoop it up with a Dixie cup. Meditate upon, there is going to come a day where I am going to see Jesus in his glorified humanity. In my glorified humanity, I will see him in his glorified humanity. And my soul, now rejoined with my body, is going to have a non-mediated, i.e. an immediate seeing of God, and I will know him as he is. And this is important. I mean, like for me as a pastor, okay, the greatest privilege I have as a pastor, then there's many of them, right? Preaching, teaching at seminaries, and preaching to my flock over at Christ Presbyterian, but there's no greater privilege than the bedside and the graveside. No greater privilege. I can't tell you how many hands of dying saints I have held as they draw their life. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't number it. To be with families at the graveside and to be able to say to them, this is not my opinion or something I've sort of half-baked and I'm going to try it out on you. This is the Word of God. Christian burial, because of the reality of the incarnation and the simplicity of God, and because of the reality of the resurrection of Christ, his ascension in his glorified humanity, I can tell you that Christian burial is never the disposal of a body. We dispose of stuff we don't need anymore. When we finish these cigars, we'll smoke them down to our fingertips, we'll dispose of the cigar butts, right? We dispose of things that we don't need or don't want or don't like. Christian burial is never the disposal of anything. It's a deposit of something precious for safekeeping. It's a resurrection deposit because Jesus, 1 Corinthians 15, is going to make a resurrection withdrawal. So going to a cemetery is not an acquiescence to death for the Christian. It is a faith-filled defiance of death. As Paul says, death, where's your sting? Grave, where's your victory? I shout into graves when I do graveside. I lean over into the grave and I shout. I say, grave, where's your victory? Death, where's your sting? Because we're not ultimately standing on burial ground. We're standing on resurrection soil. And all of that hinges upon the physical resurrection of Jesus, which is why, getting back to where we first started, and I said I had professors in college who said, the biological impossibility of the resurrection of Christ from the grave, it's a metaphor. You know, when the principles of love and neighbor love came to life in his disciples and his followers, in that way, Jesus rose up all over again from the grave. And that's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if that's all it is, we are screwed.
Yeah. Wow. Really encouraged, man. Glad we talked about the simplicity of God. So...
I'm glad you gave me a cigar.
Yeah. So God has attributes, love, joy, peace, but God is not, they are not attributes of God. God is the attributes. Is that one way to think about
think of it
the simplicity of God?
We say God has attributes, and it's true. He has attributes, but the only way he has attributes is because he is those attributes. It's not like, and this gets back to the simplicity, it's not like over in that cabinet over there on one shelf, there's love, and God takes some of that, and he gets really good at love, and he takes grace, and he adds that to himself. That's the composite kind of thing. He is love. He is grace. He is wrath. He is mercy. He is justice. And he is all of these things perfectly, infinitely, completely, and simply, and singly, if I can say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So he is his attributes.
And he's also, at that point, because he's not composite, he's also everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
He's in here.
Absolutely. What we need, and this is where Edwards is so helpful, and frankly, Van Til for that matter, Cornelius Van Til, who was the subject of my dissertation. Why they're so helpful. Getting back to your question about what would Edwards say, when I said he would say we need a more robust theology proper or doctrine of God, let's just bring it home. We need, and what will help us sort of extricate ourselves out of our default deism that frankly most Christians, they don't realize it, but we're in some sense or another, we're deists. God is the big man up in the sky. And maybe sometimes he comes in and he helps me and something good happens in my life. You know what I call it? That's a God thing. What we need is that Edwardsian, meaning Jonathan Edwards, biblical, frankly, God's suffused view of everything, his omnipotence, that he is, if we truly believed in the, his omnipresence, if we truly believe, well, his omnipotence too, we can say more about that, but his omnipresence, if we truly believed in the omnipresence of God, it would change everything. I wouldn't simply believe I'm just some guy clocking in, clocking out, trying to make it through this thing called life, and hopefully God will take notice of me if I can do enough good deeds to outweigh my bad deeds, and hopefully he grades on a curve. If we can see God as he's revealed himself to us in his omnipresence, yes, he is everywhere because there is nothing that exists that does not exist apart from the immediate creative word power of Jesus. What do I mean by that? Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. Long ago, at many times, in various ways, God spoke to the fathers and the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son. And then he goes through and gives us a list of things about the Son, through whom he made the universe. He is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, and he upholds all things by the word of his power. Jesus upholds all things by the word of his power. Well, that's a statement of providence, the providence of God. This is why Edwards railed so much against deism, that God sort of created things and natural laws, stepped away, and we just, of our own autonomy, figured those things out. Really don't need God anymore. He's the great kind of benevolent being who made everything, and now he's checked out. No, he upholds all things. He created all things. Okay, I get that. But he upholds all things by the word of his power. The other day I was with my apologetics students in high school, and they wanted to go outside. We have this tent set up outside behind the upper school, and they want to go outside because it's nice weather. So we go outside, and I'm talking to them about this, and I lean down. I say, you see this little piece of clover right here? This little piece of clover on the grass. I said, this little piece of clover coheres at the molecular level, at the immediate behest of Jesus Christ himself. The immediate creative command of Jesus keeps the molecular structure of this little piece of clover in existence. Well, if that's true for a piece of clover, and there were millions of little pieces of clover on the field there, what does it say about you and me? Mm-hmm. Years ago, I was one of our elders at church was diagnosed, sadly, with ALS. And he got to a point where he could no longer be taken out of the house. It took 3 or 4 hours just to get him ready and to go out of the house. And so he was very upset because he couldn't come to church anymore. So one of our elders, Buzz Graham, who is the paragon and the paradigm of what an elder in the Church of Jesus Christ should be. Buzz Graham, who is the father of the young lady who was my assistant and my associate at the academy, Beth Graham. We'd go over it and we'd do Bible study. And we were going through the book of Hebrews. We studied different books of the Bible through his sickness, but we go through the book of Hebrews. And I remember, as he was trying to contend with his own weakness and frailty, I'll never forget the day that he picked up weekly. He just very, within all his fragility, he picked up his Reformation study Bible. He said, David, do you know anybody who would want this? I said, well, that's your study Bible, John. Why you want to? He said, well, because I can't lift it anymore. And he had his Bible on his iPad on this like gooseneck stand. And I'll never forget when he went from his regular iPad down to an iPad mini because his mobility had decreased and he could no longer navigate the screen real estate of the big iPad. He had to go to a smaller one, and eventually went to a computer that just monitored his eyelid movement. But I was talking through Hebrews, and I said, I made the point, and where some of us gathered in his living room, some of his friends, every 2 weeks would come in, and we would do a Bible study with him. And I said, outside the window here, because I'd mowed his yard one time, he had this incredible John Deere mower that he let me use to mow his yard, and the thing would fly. And this thing was incredible.
Did it have power steering?
Oh, it was unbelievable. I mean, I flew on that thing, and my wife was there watching me do it, and John's wife was there like, oh, this was a bad idea. But I said to him, every blade of grass out there, just take one single blade of grass. According to Hebrews 1:1-3, it coheres. That blade of grass coheres at the cellular level, at the immediate word command of Jesus Christ. And then I kept going. He said, well, wait. He slurred in his speech. He said, wait. I said, what's the matter? He said, can I just think about that? Can we just stop there for a second? He said, if that is true, then what's going on in my body right now is not some stroke of bad luck. It is not some accident. Jesus is as in control of what's going on in my body, with his nerves failing him, his muscles failing him. And then I thought to myself, okay, see, here's why theology matters, man. Here's why theology matters. We need a bigger vision of Jesus, and we need a bigger vision of the omnipresence of God. You think about the disciples in Mark 4 as they're in the boat on the Sea of Galilee, and the storm comes, and they're all scared to death, right? And some of these are seasoned fishermen, and they've seen storms before. And on the one hand, that's why they're so scared, because they know what storms can do. They know that a storm that can arise on the Sea of Galilee just turn a fishing vessel to matchsticks in no time. They're scared to death. They go to Jesus and they say, do you not care, Master, that we are perishing? He says, where's your faith? He was asleep. And he wasn't saying, where's your faith? Why is your faith so weak? Don't you have faith in your own faith? Our faith is never in our faith. Weak faith in a strong Savior is a big deal. That's what he was getting across to him. Weak faith in a big Savior is a big deal. He gets up and he rebukes the wind and the sea, and the storm calms. And then it's interesting. They don't just start high-fiving each other and saying, oh, man, I'm so glad that was over. It says then that they were sore afraid. They were terrified. Mm-hmm. Why? They knew what a storm could do. They have no idea what this guy's capable of now.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And so why could Jesus command the storm? Why could he speak to the storm? Because that storm existed to begin with because of the creative word power of Jesus. Of course he could. Why could he heal people? Why could Jesus heal people? Because, well, he created them, and he was holding together their DNA to begin with, repairing the DNA that was involved in a healing of a limb or a lameness or whatever. That was no big deal for him. Mm-hmm. So the omnipresence of God, the creative word power of Jesus that we read about in Hebrews 1:1-3. We need to lay hold of those things because it's not just theological speculation. It changes everything. The way that I view the phone call from the doctor with the diagnosis that I'm fearing, the way that I view the loss of a loved one, the resurrection, how does that speak to? Here's the crazy thing. I love the way Ray Orton always says, it talks about the gospel, says, and you can get in on this.
Yeah.
Why would someone not want to get in on this?
Yeah.
You know
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, really.
And that's Edwards and Van Til's the same way at a more philosophical level. Van Til had that same God suffused view of reality that Edwards has, even though Van Til was not necessarily a student of Edwards as much as he was the Dutch tradition, Bavinck, et cetera. But you see this in Bavinck, Herman Bavinck.
Well, I have as much time as you have, but I want to be conscious of your time. I don't want to keep you all day.
No, I'm here, man.
Okay.
You've roped me in with the guidance and the underground.
You want a little more splash of guidance there?
I need another, just a snoop.
Absolutely.
Just a snoop there.
Now, I do want to hear a little bit more about Cornelius Van Til, because that's not someone I was familiar with, actually, until I saw, that you did your dissertation on him, and you have on your Instagram bio that you're what's the term, Van Tillian? Mm-hmm. Okay. What do we know about Cornelius Van Til, and why'd you do your dissertation on him?
Well, as I said earlier, I did my dissertation on him because I providentially stumbled into some untouched correspondence between him and another theologian named J. Oliver Buswell. And this had never been written about. And, the dissertation has ended up being the only thing out there right now in scholarly literature on the debate between Buswell and Van Til. And it's probably the closest thing to a biography of Buswell in existence. And, but here's the thing about Cornelius Van Til. Cornelius Van Til was a Dutchman. He was born and raised in North Indiana. I went to Calvin Seminary in Grand Rapids. And so he is from the Dutch stream of Reformed theology and would have cut his teeth on, the Belgic Confession and Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck. And so when we talk about worldview, most Christians today, when they talk about Christian worldview, whether they realize it or not, they're getting it from Francis Schaeffer. Of course, Francis Schaeffer was a student of Van Til. They had their disagreements, but Francis Schaeffer never would have talked about Christian worldview had it not been for Cornelius Van Til. And so my main academic area is that of apologetics. I love historical theology. I've done a lot of work in historical theology over the years and love historical theology because I love stories. I love the story of God's continued redemptive history after the Bible in the lives of women and men and girls and boys, and I love stories, and so I love historical theology, the history of doctrine, and philosophically I love the history of ideas. But my main area academically and probably even ministerially is apologetics. So as our listeners probably know, the word apologetics doesn't mean that we're apologizing like saying I'm sorry for something. I think there are probably a lot of things Christians probably ought to say I'm sorry for. That's a different subject. But apologetics is from the Greek word apologion. So in 1 Peter 3:15-16, Peter says, and Peter's writing not to a bunch of PhDs or seminary graduates. He's writing to common Christians who are wondering whether they're going to be alive the next week or if they're going to become lion food under Nero, right? He's writing to common people saying, but in your hearts, set apart Christ the Lord as holy. Always be ready to give an apologion when someone asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. So the word apologion is translated in our English Bibles defense. Always be ready to give a defense when someone asks you for the reason. See, there's that commitment to rationality, not rationalism. Adding ism to a word can have drastic consequences. But why is what you believe rational? Why is it reasonable? Always be ready to give an apologion, a defense, when someone asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. So I tell my students both at Westminster and RTS and at CPA, Christ Presbyterian Academy here in Nashville, that when we are all called to be apologists. Again, that's not for those who have a PhD in apologetics. It's for Christians who are being, in Peter's case, persecuted. You are to be apologists. And what that means is ultimately we are to be hope defenders. Give a defense when someone asks you, why are you so hopeful? Give a defense when someone asks you, what's the reason why you have this hope? We're called to be hope defenders. Now, the history of apologetics is variegated, and it's beautiful, and it's just an incredible study. It's one of my favorite areas of study. The early fathers, many of them were apologists. You think of Justin Martyr. You think of Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430. You think of, frankly, Aquinas, as I said a second ago, 1225 to 74, was an apologist. In his own right, Luther was, Calvin was. The history of apologetics is beautiful and it's vast. Many folks think of apologetics today, maybe because they became a Christian because they read Mere Christianity. I mean, where would we be without C.S. Lewis? I mean, I could just go on and on and on for another 4 hours about C.S. Lewis. But apologetics typically is divided up into what we might call camps: evidentialist apologists, classical apologists, and what is often called presuppositional apologists. Now, sometimes that word presuppositional is not fully understood, so I'll say a bit about that in a second. But classical apologetics, you think back to Thomas Aquinas or Anselm's ontological argument. You think about arguments for the existence of God based on logical syllogisms, oftentimes based on Aristotelian logical syllogisms. That features prominently in Thomas Aquinas. Then as you look at the history of classical apologetics, you mentioned Darcy Sproul a second ago. The Ligonier apologetic is a classical apologetic, and so it relies on arguments like the ontological argument or the teleological argument or the cosmological argument or the moral argument for the existence of God. The problem is with those arguments is that when Immanuel Kant comes along and publishes in the 18th century, he publishes in the 1770s The Critique of Pure Reason, and then David Hume as well comes along, utterly dismantles the facility of the classical arguments. Why is that? Dismantles the facility of the classical arguments because it calls into question the very possibility of knowledge to begin with, the very possibility of logic to begin with. Mm-hmm. So then, and this is 30,000 feet, very general what I'm doing. We could get more granular. But then you see a rise in evidential apologetics. And so some people may say, look, I really came to believe because I read Josh McDowell's Evidence that Demands a Verdict. Evidential apologetics, where you sort of pile up historical evidences, say, for the resurrection, which is very useful and helpful, or historical evidences for this or that aspect of Christianity. And what you do is, say, in the case of like William Lane Craig, a very brilliant philosopher and apologist, is you build what's called a cumulative case apologetic. And what is assumed in a cumulative case apologetic is neutral ground between the believer and the unbeliever. And the believer brings such an overwhelming cumulative case of evidences and just piles them deep and piles them high, that what you wind up with is an overwhelmingly high probability of the existence of God and the claims of Christianity, to the point that if you deny those claims, you are flying in the face of staggering evidence and overwhelming odds. But what's being given away there, whether we realize it or not, is the farm, meaning you are starting off on the epistemological assumption that natural man, of whom we read in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, and what we of whom we read in Romans 5 is at enmity with God. What we read in Romans 1:18 to 32, that his thinking has become futile and his heart is darkened. So both in our thinking and our willing, we are darkened and futile. We're not neutral toward God. We're not even neutral toward the evidence. No matter how much evidence you pile up for me, I'm not neutral toward it. Unless the Holy Spirit regenerates me, I'm going to find another explanation for all those incredible and legitimate evidences. Van Til comes along and says, following really, I think, the Calvinian tradition of Calvin in Book 1 of the Institutes, following the Westminsterian tradition of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was crafted from 1643 to 47, though the Westminster Assembly continued on into the early 50s, 52, 53, doing some licensing of ministerial candidates. But the Westminster Confession begins, chapter 1 of the Westminster Confession of Faith, with the doctrine of Scripture as our starting point, revelation as our starting point. How we know epistemologically anything is on the basis of revelation. And so Van Til comes along and says, all arguments are circular, meaning they are all appealing to a source of authority. So the reason I'm a Van Tillian is though while I deeply appreciate the history of apologetics, and I deeply appreciate and benefit from classical apologists and evidential apologists, the starting point epistemologically for knowing is not some neutral place of autonomous reason that we appeal to with a big pile of evidences, but our starting point, or what is known in Latin theological terminology as our principium, our starting point. So for Van Til, our principium, or more particularly, our principium essendi, is the triune God. The starting point of being is the triune God. Then the principium cognoscendi externum, the starting point of knowledge or epistemology that is external to us, is the Bible. So the triune God of the Bible and the Bible of the triune God is our starting point. There is no neutral ground. There's only that. That's why there are no brute facts evidences that we can look at like that plant over there and say, okay, that plant is a brute fact. The unbeliever interprets it one way. The believer interprets it the other way. The believer is going to try his hardest to convince the unbeliever that plant is there because God created it. No, that plant is not a brute fact. It is not an uninterpreted fact. Not just that it's not interpreted already by the unbeliever or the believer, but that the God who created it has already given it its meaning. And so God is not dependent upon us to give meaning to anything, hoping that we will arrive at confidence in the high likelihood of his existence. So our knowledge, all of our knowing as believers, is analogous to what God has already revealed. It's analogous to his knowledge. And our starting point for knowing it, the basis of our epistemology, is the triune God of the Bible and the Bible of the triune God. Now, someone's going to say, I've got you here, David. That's a circular argument. How do I know that the Bible is true? Because the Bible testifies to its truth. That's a circular argument. Van Til would say, yeah, it is. All arguments are circular. There's no such thing as an argument that is not circular. The question is it a virtuous or a vicious circle? Meaning this, can the authority being appealed to account for the requisites of intelligibility and reality as we know it? So in the case of, say, autonomous human reasoning, interpreting something or interpreting the likelihood of God's existence, that's a circular argument whether they say yes or no, because they are appealing to the starting point of their own autonomous reasoning. The question is, can the autonomous reasoning that assumes from the beginning God doesn't exist account for the requisites of intelligibility and reality as we know it? The Christian worldview can. Triune God of the Bible, Bible of the triune God, can account for the requisites of intelligibility and reality as we know it, meaning what? What are the requisites of intelligibility? The laws of logic, the laws of induction. Scientific inquiry depends upon the laws of induction. The Christian worldview can account for the laws of induction. An atheistic worldview cannot account for the laws of induction. I'll explain more about that in a second. The laws of deduction, math depends upon that. Christian worldview can account for the laws of deduction. Atheistic worldview can't. The normativity of nature upon which science depends. Well, the Christian worldview, where Jesus is sustaining all things by the word of his power, has created all things, can account for the normativity of nature upon which scientific inquiry begins. An atheistic worldview, in which everything that exists is a matter of matter and energy and randomness, can't account for the normativity of anything. It assumes it borrows that from the Christian worldview and tries to mount a logical argument against the Christian worldview, but it's borrowing epistemological capital, Van Til would say, from the only worldview that can account for the normativity of nature or the laws of logic. Objectivity of predication. Well, because we believe in the logos, we believe in objectivity in predication, that words actually have meaning. The atheistic worldview, where all that exists is matter, what is objectivity? What is predication? What is a word? That's why in many ways, Wittgenstein and Derrida and Rorty, what we consider postmodernism is what apologist at Westminster Seminary Bill Edgar says is most modernism. It's basically taking atheistic assumptions about meaninglessness and applying it to language. Language is meaningless, which just, they're symbols that we, but here's the problem with that. If I say words have no meaning, what am I assuming? At least that the words that are in that sentence have meaning, right? Words have no meaning. Well, do those words have meaning?
Yeah.
There is no absolute truth. Well, is that absolutely true? So the objectivity of predication, personhood, right? The Christian worldview can account for personhood. The atheistic worldview cannot account for personhood. Again, that's why I appreciate Sam Harris. I really do. We are just biochemical puppets. We're flesh machines. We're just a matter of matter. That's all we are. We're matter. And that randomly and chaotically, there is no such thing as personhood. And that kind of ties into morality and ethics. By what standard do we say anything is right or wrong? My opinion, my prejudice, my society, my culture. The Christian worldview can account for morality because it is grounded in the objective revelation of God and His Word and the law of God. An atheistic worldview cannot account for morality. Can't account for the laws of logic. For instance, if an atheist says, "No, we're the logical ones as atheists. You Christians are you believe in unicorns or whatever. You're the illogical ones." Well, account for logic. I'm not saying you don't use logic. Account for how your worldview can account for logic. Can your worldview? I'm not saying can you use logic. There are brilliant atheists out there, brilliant. But can their atheistic worldview, in which all that is matter and energy, account for logic? All that is matter. When's the last time you stumped your toe on a law of logic? When's the last time you felt of a law of logic or tasted a law of logic? The laws of logic, by very definition, are immaterial. They don't fit in a materialist construct, right? Mm-hmm. And so what the atheists would have to say, and this is what they do say, is what we call the laws of logic are the consensus maxims of man as he's evolved. Okay, so Homo sapiens have evolved, and they have, over time, consented that these are the laws of logic, say the law of the excluded middle or the law of non-contradiction or whatever, laws of logic. Those are the laws of logic because they just are the way things are, and those are the laws of logic. And we say, okay, so they were consented upon at some point as man developed. Yes. Okay, question. Were those laws of logic logically true before man evolved and consented to them? Now they're backed into a corner. If they say yes, they were logically true, they're arguing transcendentally, and there is nothing transcendent in a materialist worldview. There's only matter. If they say no, they weren't logically true until man consented and called them that, then it's pure subjectivity. And there's nothing to say that what we call a logical law today couldn't be changed tomorrow if man consents and gets a committee together and changes it. And so the objectivity of the laws of logic can only be accounted for according to a Christian worldview. No other worldview can account for the laws of logic. And so Van Til says we argue transcendentally. There is a transcendent basis to reality as you experience it that can account for reality as we experience it. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's heady stuff. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to wrap your mind, for me, around all of that in a short amount of time.
Well, take morality for a second. But I can see
the logic behind it.
Yeah, take morality. This will be a little more, I think our listeners can maybe lay hold of this a little bit more easily. Take the laws of the morality. Take morality, ethics. A Christian worldview can account for morality because morality is grounded in the standard of God's being, which is expressed, His holy being, which is expressed in His law. Mm-hmm. And we see that in His word. Well, let's say I'm an atheist, and one of the things, you remember Christopher Hitchens, who was just brilliant and witty and rough-hewn, and just he's one of my favorite writers. Christopher Hitchens, he passed away sadly of cancer December 15th, 2011. And Christopher Hitchens, who wrote God Is Not Great, back when the whole cottage industry of neo-atheism was kind of bubbling up back in the early 2000s, he wrote God Is Not Great. And one of the things that Christopher Hitchens always kind of made the sine qua non of his argumentation was religion poisons everything, and religion has led to so much immorality and suffering and evil. Okay, well, I think we have to say, yeah, a lot of people have done a lot of evil and wrong things in the name of Christianity, right? We need to admit that and own it and say, that's not what Christianity teaches, but it's what some boneheaded Christians have done. We need to own it. But here's the thing. If I'm an atheist and my worldview is a worldview of micromutational Darwinian evolution, and what exists is matter and energy, then what I call morality at the end of the day has no transcendent standard of absolute right and absolute wrong. Morals are utterly utilitarian. Ethics becomes statistics. Mm-hmm. Morality is mob rules. And so if we say something like, well, and this is what they'll say, well, morality is whatever does the most good for the most amount of people, kind of a utilitarian ethic. Okay, according to your worldview, what is necessarily right about doing the most amount of good for the most amount of people? What's right about that? Mm-hmm. You may like it, but liking something doesn't make it right. So the atheist, right, would stand at the gates of Auschwitz, and they might be able to say, I don't like what happened in there. It disgusts me, frightens me what happened in there. But they have no worldview basis to account for what happened in there being objectively, morally wrong, because all that exists is matter. And let's go even further. Years ago, I was teaching a class, years and years ago, teaching a class over at Weston Community Church, PCA church over off of Whitebridge. And there was a young man in there who was a PhD student at Vanderbilt. He was an MD and working on a research PhD. His one of his advisors there was an atheist, a biologist, and said to him, look, if you're going to make it, if you're really going to progress in this field and be taken seriously, you need to give up this idea of Jesus and Christianity and what you call faith. You need to realize that what you call faith and belief is just chemical reactions and responses in your brain. You're clinging to it like it's something real. It's just chemical actions and reactions. And he was really distraught over this. And he came to me and said, is that true? What I'm feeling is a faith in Jesus, a love for Jesus. Is it just chemical actions and reactions and neurons firing in my brain? Is that all it is? And I said, because that's what he's telling me it is. It's okay. I said, ask him. I said, is he married? He said, yeah. I said, okay, tell him to go home to his wife. And when he goes home to his wife, say, honey, I love you. And when she says, oh, baby, thank you. I love you too. But I need you to know that what I'm calling love for you is simply a bodily function. It's simply chemicals firing off in my brain, neurons firing off in my brain, and thus is of no more intrinsic value or reality than any other bodily function. And I'll be delicate as to what I said other bodily functions can consist of. Mm-hmm. In other words, from an atheist worldview, what is the difference if all that our thoughts are just chemical actions and reactions? What's the difference between what we call thought and what we call any other bodily function? It's just chemicals and matter acting and reacting, and there's no inherent value, which is why I appreciate Sam Harris. We're biochemical puppets, right? We're biochemical puppets. But as C.S. Lewis said, if it is true that all my thoughts are simply chemical actions and reactions, I have no reason to trust my thought that all my thoughts are chemical actions and reactions. So what Van Til does for us is he shows us the inescapable reality of the triune God, not just as some nebulous being in the sky, mm-hmm. but as he said, the absolute proof of Christianity is that apart from it, you can't prove anything at all. Mm-hmm. Apart from the Christian worldview, even the concept of proof is rendered meaningless. Even the concept of evidence and logic is rendered meaningless. Worldviews arguing against Christianity have to borrow the epistemological capital that only Christianity can account for in order to argue against Christianity, because their worldviews do not contain that epistemology. Yeah. And actually, their worldviews mitigate against that actually being true.
You mentioned Van Til came from the Dutch stream of Reformed theology. Mm-hmm. Does Kevin DeYoung with the Gospel Coalition didn't he have a Dutch background?
Yeah,
as well?
Of course, with his name, Kevin DeYoung, who also teaches at RTS Charlotte and is the pastor of a church there in Matthews, North Carolina, PCA Church in Matthews, which is a suburb of Charlotte. Christ Covenant Church there. Yes, he has a Dutch background, but he actually did his doctoral work in John Witherspoon. And so there epistemologically, you're focusing on what we call the Scottish tradition, or what's called Scottish common sense philosophy, which was part of the stream that led to Old Princeton Theological Seminary. Archibald Alexander, Charles Hodge, B.B. Warfield, who wasn't a great blues guitar player, but an early theologian at Princeton, B.B. Warfield. And so his focus is on John Witherspoon and the Scottish stream of the Reformation. So, but Van Til was from the Dutch stream of Reformed theology. He was Dutch himself. Okay. That's why he's so hard to read. When you read Dutch guys in English, it's almost just as easy just to learn the Dutch and read the Dutch. I'm not kidding. Oh, okay. It's just not the most eloquent prose. I see.
Do you still read Van Til? I mean, is there still works out there that you haven't gotten your hands on yet? Or have you read pretty well everything that he's got at this point? I think I have read probably 90% of everything. I've actually read every letter he's ever written. That was part of my research I'd go up and I would just comb through thousands of pages of handwritten letters, because they didn't have email and text back then, and everything was done by letters. I've read every letter. I've read everything. I taught for my advisor, who's Scott Oliphant, who is the world's foremost expert on Van Til. He was on sabbatical last semester, and I taught
for him at Westminster, Apologetics 213, which is the advanced apologetics course at Westminster. And so I'm always reading Van Til, and I'm always reading Van Til because he's difficult. He's difficult, and you have to kind of stay with him because he is very difficult. But I'll tell you, I think Van Til, I'm going to go ahead and make a pretty bold statement. I think Van Til, for me, was the most significant theologian of last century. Died in 87. And because I don't know of any other theologian who more thoroughgoingly applied the reality of the Trinity to theology and apologetics like Van Til did.
Wow. Spark up for this last question. You're going to need it.
My only complaint about these cigars is they shrink up. What's up with that?
Yeah,
they shrink.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Right?
I know, right? What's up with that?
Who would have thought the cigar would get shorter as you smoke it? I am curious, though, what are your thoughts on the possibility of extraterrestrial life?
Yeah. Well, I'm a man under authority, meaning I'm under the authority of God's word. And so I can only confidently say what I think I can support scripturally. And so when you speak of life, like extraterrestrial life, I guess you have to determine, what do you mean by life? Do you mean like some kind of cellular life or some kind of other, like Star Wars kind of thing? Which I'm down with because, I can do a great Chewbacca, right? But yeah, I think I'm going to have to say, given the fact that my epistemology is revelationally grounded, I don't have any basis to suggest or speculate on extraterrestrial life.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. So we don't see in Scripture a suggestion anywhere that there's certainly any other planet that has human-like beings on. I mean, that just doesn't pop up in Scripture.
Yeah.
So
It doesn't.
There seems to be a renewed interest in that. I think it's from is it the NSA or the FBI that's come out and saying that they're finding some of these unidentified flying objects and they don't know where it came from, but they know that it wasn't made on Earth. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I will say this: if you consider the universe and the galaxies and the study of astrophysics and astronomy and all those kind of things, I mean, the vastness of God's created order is beyond our wildest imagination. And so is it conceivable that there are things out there that God in his sovereignty and for his own glory and good pleasure has created and entertained? I don't think I can say dogmatically no.
Sure.
But again, as I said, I'm a man under authority, namely that of the Scripture, and from a revelational epistemology, I have no basis upon which to assert that.
Yep.
And even if I asserted it, here's one of the beautiful things about being what I call a covenantal. This is Scott Oliphant, my advisor. Presuppositional apologetics is covenantal apologetics. Because sometimes people say, well, I'm a presuppositionalist. We all have presuppositions. We all have pre-commitments. That's not what presuppositional apologetics is. Van Til, by saying presupposition, it was actually J. Oliver Buswell who foisted upon Van Til the moniker of presuppositionalist. And Buswell took that to mean only this, that we all have presuppositions and we all come with pre-commitments. And what Van Til was saying, no, by presuppositional, I mean a covenantal Trinitarian apologetic, a covenantal relational Trinitarian apologetic that asks the question, not do you have presuppositions and do I have presuppositions, but what is the worldview, what is the epistemological environment that can account for proof, that can account for logic, that can account for reality? Because it's one thing to assert, it's another thing to account. You can assert all day long. To assert is cheap. To account for something, right? You can reject someone's argument, but to refute an argument is a different thing. And so one of the beautiful things about Van Tilian apologetics is that not only does it assert, it accounts for what it can assert, and not only does it reject false arguments or other worldviews, it can actually refute those other worldviews. So there's a difference. Now, that said, if we look at something like extraterrestrial life or whatever, I could assert all day long, I believe there are aliens out there, but can I account for it? Mm-hmm. And so that's what we want to be beholden to. Yeah, is a worldview that can account, not just assert. Yeah, that makes sense.
When you are on your back porch smoking a cigar, enjoying some bourbon, and you're not reading a book, maybe you're just reflecting and thinking, what are, and here we are, fall of 2020, with everything that's going on, like, what are your questions, or what are your thoughts or concerns about kind of everything that's going on politically, societally, just at a big picture? I mean, what do you think about when you have spare time to think?
I wonder what kind of cultural milieu will my kids become adults in? What are the things they will face? Will I be here to protect them?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because only the Lord knows the number of our days. I think about what will it mean for my kids to, what things will they be facing? What forms of Gnosticism? Because that's basically what we're dealing with. Christian theism and various forms of Gnosticism. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what Abraham Kuyper was reflecting on in the Stone Lectures in Princeton, when he was reflecting on the French Revolution of the 1790s, and its effect in Europe. You have, rationalism and materialism on the one hand, and various forms of kind of proto-New Age spiritualism and Gnosticism on the other, taking over Europe. I wonder what of that will my kids have to face. I think about that. I think about. I tell you what I've been thinking about recently. I've been asking God, as the old hymn says, never, never let me outlive my love for thee. Because I hear about Christian ministers and other Christian leaders and speakers and authors and so forth who have fallen. And even recently, there was the news of one who allegedly has fallen in a very, very egregious manner. And I lately have been thinking, Lord, how in the world have I not fallen? How have I not fallen? And Lord, please let me always have kind of a low-grade godly fear that I could fall next week. Don't let me become presumptuous. As the scriptures, keep my hand back from presumptuous sins. I think about that. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. I think about Jesus a lot. I just think about him. I just think about who he is, what he's revealed in his word. I think about who he is, and I engage with him. Mm-hmm. I believe he's a person, not just a proposition. As I said, you can't do away with propositional truth. The old statement that it's often attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, but there's no proof that he said it. Preach the gospel and, if necessary, use words. And to postmodern ears, that sounds really good. But if that's really true, somebody should have told God, because he wrote a big book full of words. Right? So you can't escape propositional truth. We need it. But I think about the person of Christ. Mm-hmm. I think about my wife, what it means for us as we are about to be empty nesters. What does it mean for us to be faithful as we age? Think about that. I think about what does she need from me now to love her well? What does it mean, for a husband to beautify his wife? We read in Ephesians 5 that Christ presents us as his bride, spotless and without blemish. What does it mean for a husband? What is a husband's responsibility to beautify his wife when everything in culture tells women that unless you kind of measure up to some, Victoria's Secret standard, you're not beautiful? What does it mean to beautify our wives? I think about that. I think about our dog Zeke, who has cancer and is probably not going to be with us for much longer. I think about what a gift he's been to us. I think about, I'm thinking constantly about apologetics. I'm constantly thinking about arguments, not because I want to just bloviate and pontificate, but I want, when, as Schaeffer said, honest questions come up, I want to be able to give honest answers. Mm-hmm. It matters. Last year I had some senior girls in my class, CPA, who came to me and said, they're taking apologetics, and they came to me and said with tears, if we had had this class 2 years ago, it would have changed some of the decisions we've been making over the last 2 years. right? And I think about evangelism a lot. I think about evangelism. If somebody says, "What do you do at the academy?" I say, I evangelize kids of Christian parents. Pray with them to receive Christ. They come into the hobbit hole, and I pray with them to receive Christ. I think about that. I think about political history. I think about political philosophy, especially in light of a lot of what's going on now in culture. Those are some things off the top of my head.
Yeah.
And then I typically am thinking about how the particular cigar I'm smoking compares to the one I had earlier that week.
Right.
And this
Some
one
is
a spicy one. I like this one.
It's good, isn't it?
Anything Undercrans does.
Absolutely.
I'm a believer.
Yeah, me too. Just recently. Well, brother, you are beautiful and brilliant and big-hearted. Thank you for coming by and sharing your knowledge with us, your heart with us. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
This has been a delight. Thank you for patiently waiting with my crazy schedule. This has just been.
I would work through that schedule again to have you back on one day.
You just tell me when and where, and just put my name on this glass right here.
I'll do it. Cheers, brother.
Cheers.
Thank you.
The Lord bless you.
Fantastic.